Well, great, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining today's workshop hosted by Common Cause. My name is Zach Beck. I'm the City Clerk of Escondido, California, and I'm looking at being your MC throughout this morning. Today, we're going to take a look at how redistricting works at the local level with experts on public engagement, mapping software, the Voting Rights Act, and implementation. This year's redistricting cycle brings some new legal challenges and some new legal requirements. Today, we're going to outline some of those requirements, as well as the best practices for implementing them from experts in the field. So what I want to encourage you this morning is going to be very engaging. We're going to have a lot to talk about, and we want you to be able to submit any questions that you have in the chat box on the side throughout the entire morning. We'll be able to have a team member from Common Cause set that and be able to have them bring that to myself to bring up to the different panelists that we have. So throughout the morning, we'll have plenty of opportunities for you to ask those questions. And like I said, at any time, if you have a question, please ask it in the chat box, and we'll make sure that it gets asked. We also take a break midway point throughout the morning, and we'll conclude at noon sharp. If you have any questions about logistics, please ask them in the chat, and someone from Common Cause team will be able to get back to you as soon as possible to make sure you're taken care of. And we will also be recording today's session, so we'll be able to provide to you afterwards. That way you can share with others who would be able to benefit from it, and then you could look back to it when you're going through your own redistricting process in your city, county, or your district. And to start us off, we actually have Kathay Feng from Common Cause, and she's going to give us an overview of Redistricting Basics. And to give you some background, Kathay Feng is Common Cause's National Redistricting Director. She has led Common Cause's work to challenge partisan and incumbent gerrymandering through litigation, state-based organizing around ballot initiatives and legislation, and creating new platforms for community-based redistricting. As the former executive director of California Common Cause, she championed and won redistricting reforms, stronger government sunshine accountability laws, campaign finance reforms, and the voting rights of traditionally disenfranchised communities. So Kathay, please take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Zach. Can everybody hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, great. So I just want to quickly mention that there is a hashtag for those of you who haven't been scared off from Twitter, and that is hashtag #LocalMapsCA. If you hear something that you want to share with your friends, please do put us in that hashtag #LocalMapsCA. All right, let's get started. So today's session, next, we're going to be talking about a couple of different things next. We're going to talk first quickly about an overview of what is redistricting. Now, I know a lot of you know this already, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what that is. Next. We'll also be talking about why redistricting, if it's done right, can really help community health, right? And that means whatever city, town, area that you live in, making sure that we're doing redistricting in a way that brings in a lot of people into that process. Next. And then lastly, we'll be talking about how you, as local, county, and city election officials, as commissioners, as people who are working at the state level, can create a transparent and inclusive redistricting process. Next. So here's the basics. Each district has to have an equal number of residents. That's basically why we do redistricting every 10 years or sometimes more often, right? And that is that we know that we take a census. We count how many people live in a place. Here in our imaginary town, we have a total of 20 people, and we have an imaginary 4 districts. When you take 20 divided by 4, you end up with the simple math of 5. That means that each district should have 5 people. Next. Now, over time, people move, and that population can be uneven. People can move because there are people who are moving from more expensive places to live to less expensive places to live. We know from the pandemic that lots of people moved in with mom and dad or with sons and daughters. We also know that there are people who are born or who pass away along that decade period of time. And so we can end up with districts that have an uneven number of people because of all of that movement or change in population. Next. And so the next 10 years, again, so we just took a census in 2020. We count everyone. We figure out what that total population is, and then we redraw those lines. And here, our population of this imaginary city has grown from 20 to 24. we take the same number of districts, 4 districts, we divide that by 4, divide 24 by 4, and you end up with 6. That gives you your ideal number that you're shooting for drawing those districts. Now, that general principle of how many people you want to draw into a district in order to make them an equal number or equipopulous is called one person, one vote. You'll hear that lots and lots in our courts. What that essentially means is, how do we take a total population of a place and ensure that the district size or population is the same as the neighboring district? That's one person, one vote. Next. One of the things that we have to pay very close attention to is thinking about where minority communities live, or frankly, just any community is, right? One of the things that we can oftentimes encounter is that you can have a community that might be located in a geographically fairly compact space, but because they either were not part of the redistricting process, their voices weren't heard, or somebody was actively ignoring them, that a line can be drawn right through that community. And so in this imaginary city of 16 people, this community happens to be centered in the middle of the city, but because these districts were drawn, in this case, what is a very square, compact, evenly shaped district by one measure, but because it goes right through this community, it divides it 4 ways, and you end up with a community that in any particular district, they're only 1 in 4, which means that they have a very hard time electing a candidate of their choice. Next. There's a very different way of thinking about this community, which is if we listen to the testimony of people who are telling you, hey, we are a community that shares interests, that shares an identity and a history. Please don't cut us up into districts. You can pay attention to that and end up drawing them into a district that keeps them whole. And in this instance, they're now at the center of a particular district, so they form 3/4 of that district, thereby giving them the ability to elect a candidate of their choice. Now, some of our speakers will be getting into much more detail about the Voting Rights Act and the California Voting Rights Act, which will give you some basis of understanding what the legal requirements are for ensuring that certain protected minorities under federal law and state law, that we're doing what we can to legally draw districts that hold them together. At the same time, our state law also requires that we pay attention to communities of interest, and that has a much broader definition. It can be defined by ethnicity or race, but it can also be defined by so many other things. And holding those communities together is also an important function throughout California, and we will have speakers who give you much more detail about that. So stay tuned. Next. Can anybody in the chat tell me where you think this photo is from? I'm gonna, okay. So the UK, all right, good guess. Paradise, Watts. Okay, somebody's been paying attention to some of my presentations. This is not Minnesota. This is not the United Kingdom. This is not even Northern California. This is in Southern California in the community of Watts. And Watts is a community that is predominantly, it's historically African-American, has a very large and growing Latino population. And you can imagine in Southern California, this is not the kind of precipitation that we usually get. In 2003, the community was hit hard by a snow and hailstorm. It crushed 150 houses and buildings, and people were displaced for many, many months as they tried to rebuild. People were literally unprepared and buried under snow. And the community went to their legislative leaders and their congressional leaders to ask for federal emergency support to be able to dig out of the snow, to rebuild and to try to give people some way to sustain themselves as they rebuilt their lives. Unfortunately, in 2001, the legislature, when it was drawing the lines, ended up coming up with a sweetheart deal between Democrats and Republicans, but the community of Watts was split into multiple pieces. Next slide. And so when those community members went to the congressional members to ask for support, Watts is in this light shade of green and the district lines are drawn in red. You'll see that Watts was split between 3 different congressional seats. And so as they went to talk to their congressional members to ask for some kind of federal emergency aid, they were told time and time again, you're not exactly in my district. Can you go next door to the next congressional member because I really can't help you, right? Unfortunately, that split was replicated not only at the congressional level, but also, next slide, at the state Senate and state assembly level. So when this community that was crushed by a freak hailstorm went to ask for aid, they were told that they couldn't be helped. Next slide. In fact, actually, we talked to one of the congressional aides who was working for a congressional member at the time, and he remembers the heartbreaking meeting, couldn't help these residents. And he said, this would never have happened if Watts belonged all in one single district. Now, the good news is that in California, since 2003, the people have come together to pass Propositions 11 and 20. And so we created a new Redistricting Commission. Next slide. And that Redistricting Commission took testimony from communities around the state. When Watts came to them, they said, you know, you're right, that's a community, let's put you together. And so Watts was made whole within the congressional district and at other levels of government as well. And finally, rather than being split into 3 pieces, they had the ability to unify their voice and elect a candidate of their choice. Next slide. The exciting thing is that California has sparked a redistricting revolution around the country. Many states have adopted independent commissions, and certainly around the state, many cities and counties, and I'm going to just give you all a shout out because you deserve it: Berkeley, Chula Vista, Escondido, Oakland, Long Beach, County of Los Angeles, Roseville, Sacramento, San Diego, Santa Barbara, and Sacramento, Roseville, have all passed some type of redistricting reform. So that means that the commissions that exist in those cities and counties are made up of regular people who will be taking in testimony to hear what their community wants and to be able to draw those lines. The exciting thing is, regardless of what county or city you're in, even if you're in a city or county where your electeds are drawing the lines, you as election administration officials have the ability to ensure that the process is as transparent and as inclusive as possible. Next slide. So I like to think of redistricting principles as 3 different layers. At the center of it, the blue circle is trying to make sure that community input is always something that's driving how you're thinking about the new district maps, right? The second layer out is creating a transparent and inclusive process because especially in these COVID days, when we are all communicating through Zoom, we've got to take an extra effort to sort of think about, okay, if you can't come to a hearing room, if you can't speak in front of a microphone, how do we make sure that that process that people kind of come to you to tell you where their communities are is inclusive, that they know about it, that they understand what redistricting is, and that the conversation that's happening between decision makers is as open and transparent as possible. And last, if you do that, if you make sure that it's transparent, inclusive, and that it centers on community input, you will have public confidence in the maps that are ultimately created, and you will be able to adopt equitable district maps. Next slide. So we will be talking through the rest of this day's conference about how you can create a more transparent and inclusive process. The following sessions will be focused on things like the new state laws on local redistricting that offer a roadmap for how you can create a more transparent and public engagement process. We'll also have local leaders who will talk about how you can engage people who don't think about redistricting all day long. It certainly isn't at the top of their list, but who do want to come to you to be involved in this process. We'll also talk about best practices that have been developed by cities and redistricting experts around California. so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's so much knowledge and thinking out there, and this is really a forum for sharing that information. And then lastly, we'll be talking about publicly available mapping tools and technology to make it easier to be able to facilitate people giving you information, and also to be able to show the public, here's our progress along the way. This is what the map or the draft maps look like. Next slide. It is not too late to start, and I am just going to applaud every single one of you for coming together on January 28th and already starting to think hard about learning and planning for this upcoming redistricting cycle. The good news is, this is a weird good news, but because the Census Bureau had to delay its operations because of COVID last year, that means that the redistricting data is not coming out until July or August of this year. Okay, what that means is that you now have the, I'm going to call it an opportunity, to begin planning right now to line up your resources, to think about what a robust education and outreach plan is going to be, to talk to community leaders and also your decision makers, right? To make sure that everything is lined up. You can already begin to have community meetings about taking in input before that redistricting data comes, so that by the time the data comes in July and August, you're off and running and you've already got a lot of the base information. So good job, you all. You're already on the right track. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Next slide. This is just a quick roadmap of some of the sessions that we're going to be having today. I won't repeat them, but these are the sessions where we will be talking about these specific topics. And remember, if you've got any insights or information that you've just learned that you want to share, please do tweet it out at hashtag #LocalMapsCA. Thanks, everybody.
Great.
Back to you, Zach.
Thank you, Kathy, for that overview of redistricting and the roadmap for today's training. Next, we're going to our first panel of the morning, which is for full public engagement. This panel will discuss California's transparency and hearing requirements and best practices for engaging the public throughout the redistricting process. So I want to introduce a few of our speakers. First, we have Nicolas Heidorn, and he is a chief consultant of the California Senate Elections and Redistricting Committee. Nicolas was formerly the policy director for California Common Cause, where he has led the organization's legislative advocacy in Sacramento and was the founder and director of the California Local Redistricting Project, a joint Common Cause McGeorge School of Law effort to promote local redistricting best practices. Next, we will hear from Jonathan Mehta Stein, Executive Director of California Common Cause, a civil rights attorney and longtime democracy reform advocate. Jonathan spent 4 years as head of the Voting Rights and Census Program at Asian Lost Caucus, where he worked to increase access to California's democracy for historically disenfranchised communities. Jonathan previously worked as a voting rights staff attorney for the ACLU of California and was the chair of the Oakland Public Ethics Commission. And last but not least, we'll hear from Randi Joel, City Clerk and Director of Legislative Affairs for the City of Temecula. She brings over 20 plus years of experience and leadership in municipal government. She has served cities and special districts throughout the state of California in various capacities, including as a law clerk in a municipal law firm, a legal analyst, a legislative affairs director, and a city clerk. Randi serves as the legislative director for the California City Clerks Association and a board member for the League of California Cities and Institute for Local Government. Randi Joel received her Juris Doctorate from Trinity Law and Graduate School. Here you go, Nicolas. Get us started.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? By show, okay, great. I'm going to try and share my screen here. All right, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Great. Okay, thank you everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Nicolas Heidorn. I'm the Chief Consultant of the California State Senate Elections Committee. Prior to that, I was the Policy Director and Legislative Advocate with California Common Cause, where I had the great pleasure to work with a lot of city clerks and county registrars, including on some of the redistricting laws that we'll be talking about. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to you all. What I'm going to be discussing today are the minimum legal requirements for public hearings and outreach in redistricting. So if you participated in redistricting for your city or county 10 years ago, the process is going to be fairly different this time around. That's because in 2019, Assemblymember Bonta passed AB 849, also known as the Fair Maps Act, as well as follow-up legislation last year, AB 1276, which did some cleanup and timing changes. If you look at the legislative history of the Fair Maps Act, it's fairly clear that one of the main thrusts and main purposes of this legislation was to try and really make the redistricting process at the local level much more inclusive, to ensure a lot more public engagement, and also to include a lot more communities, including communities that often don't participate a lot within local government generally, and certainly in redistricting. And so the goal of this is to try and create a more engaged process, and also one where everyone is included in drawing lines that will hopefully then be more representative and lead to a better quality of democracy. Because of course, the lines that you're adopting will last for the next decade, so shape the character of your local democracy for the next decade. So a quick overview of the Act. AB 849 only applies to cities and counties. Others like schools and districts remain under the old rules. So what we're talking about today is really just for cities and counties. The primary changes, AB 849 does kind of 5 buckets of main changes. So it puts in place new redistricting criteria. It has some changes to the deadlines for adopting maps. It increases the requirement from 1 public hearing prior to adopting maps to 4. Has greater notice and outreach requirements. And finally, for the first time, includes some translation requirements to ensure that non-English speaking communities can also be an engaged part of this process. I'm only going to be discussing the last 3 bullets with you all today. I think later on in this presentation, you'll probably hear a little bit more about the first 2. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump in. In terms of the outreach requirements, one of the first things that you're going to need to do is create a dedicated web page on your city or county website. This web page is really going to become kind of the public's main portal to your redistricting process. So there's some minimum requirements for what's on that web page. You're going to have an explanation of the redistricting process and how the public can provide public comment, the calendar of all your hearings, notices and agendas for those hearings, a recording, video or audio of your redistricting hearings, or in the alternative, a written summary, any of the draft maps that your city council or board of supervisors considers, and then to cap off your process, the map that you ultimately end up adopting. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these sub-elements in later slides. One of the other main requirements is that you need to take steps to encourage public participation. So there's a requirement of outreach. Now that is not, it is kind of left to your discretion what those steps are, but there is a minimum, and it says including a quote, good faith effort to provide information to the local media. So think TV, radio, print, as well as provide information through quote, good government, civil rights, civic engagement, and community groups or organizations. And I think you'll be hearing a lot more from later panelists on how to really engage all those different types of community groups. Lastly, inclusive within those 2 groups is including language minority publications and or organizations. So one of the things that you'll probably want to do is take a little bit of an accounting of what the resources or who are the groups that your city or county interacts with. So look at your media distribution list. Does it include media organizations that serve significant non-English speaking populations in your city or county? Similarly, what are the community groups that you typically interact with? And this is a good opportunity to just make sure that that's being done in a way that hits multiple communities within your jurisdiction, including these language minority communities. Another requirement, though, which is intended to capture groups that you may not be aware of, is to ensure that there's some way for people who affirmatively come to the city or county and say, we want to be notified about redistricting. You have to provide that opportunity. So people need some way to sign up to receive notifications about redistricting. It's not legally required that this be on your website, but it's probably a good idea that you have this on your website. So maybe an email listserv or something like that. As mentioned before, on the website, you will have to post information on the redistricting process and how to do public comment. And that's also going to have to be posted for certain applicable non-English languages in your community. And I'll go into how that's determined later. The good news on this is that you don't need to invent this wheel. This wheel, so to speak, has already been done. The Secretary of State has posted templates in something like a dozen languages that includes an explanation of the redistricting process and includes how you can provide public comment. And then there's a series of blanks for your community to put in things like your own hearing dates. So if you take those templates are designed to meet the requirements of posting that information. You can take those templates, put it on your website. I'll also add that those templates can be useful as you consider some of your other outreach. When you're reaching out to language minority communities, for example, if you don't have someone on staff who speaks that language, these templates include a lot of good, simple explanation of the redistricting process in that language so that media organizations serving that community have language they can draw from to try and explain that process. We go now to one of the hearts of this bill, and that's the 4 public hearings. So there is a requirement that you hold a minimum of 4 public hearings in this process. One of those has to be a pre-draft map hearing. What that means is before the city or county releases its own draft maps that it wants to consider, you have to hold at least one hearing for the public to be able to come and provide their comments on what their communities look like or how they'd like to see the districts drawn. You also need to do 2 post-draft maps hearings. So after the city or county has released its draft maps that it wants to consider, there needs to be an opportunity for the public to provide comment on what they think of those draft maps. Now, for those of you who are good at math, you'll see that there's 4 public hearings, but 1 + 2 only equals 3. So the answer is that that 4th public hearing can either be a pre-draft map or a post-draft map. That's in your discretion. So you can have 1 pre-draft map hearing and 3 post-draft map hearings, or you could do 2 and 2. And of course, all of this is a floor, not a ceiling. So you're well within your right to hold as many hearings as you want, provide even more opportunities for the public to participate and provide comment. But there is a minimum requirement of 4 public hearings before adopting that. I will flag, of course, that some jurisdictions that Kathay already mentioned have kind of adopted commissions, for example, or have other requirements requiring even more hearings. You'll likely know if that applies to your community, but for example, LA and San Diego in state law are required to hold more hearings, and some charter cities and counties have also chosen for themselves to do more hearings. So of course, be cognizant to any particular rules in your jurisdiction. Let's talk a little bit more about those pre-draft map hearings. So again, you have a minimum requirement of 1 to 2. In terms of the timing, these can be held at any time. There's no requirement that the census data be out before you start holding those hearings. So this is really up to your jurisdiction how you schedule those. In terms of who can hold them, the default, of course, is that your city council or your board of supervisors will hold those pre-draft map hearings, but state law provides several alternatives as well that you may wish to consider. So you can get credit for one of those hearings by having staff or your consultant conduct a workshop. They can, of course, staff can conduct multiple workshops, but you'll only get credit towards one of those pre-draft map hearing requirements by having a staff workshop. You can also set up an advisory redistricting commission, and the advisory redistricting commission can get credit for all the pre-draft map hearings that you're required to do. So of course, an advisory commission could hold 4 pre-draft map hearings, but it would only get credit for the maximum of 2 pre-draft map hearings. I did put the code section there, elections code 23002. If you are a general law city or a county and you set up an advisory commission, take a look at that code section. There's some pretty minimal requirements for advisory commissions that you will have to follow if you choose to go that route. Another route is you could set up an independent redistricting commission. An independent commission is different from an advisory commission in that you've fully turned over the redistricting process to that commission. So it has the power to adopt maps without the up or down vote of the city council or board. In essence, if you choose to go the independent commission route, all the requirements that would have applied to the city council or board of supervisors are transferred to that independent commission. So the pre-draft map hearings, the post-draft map hearings, all that would now be the responsibility of the independent commission. Elections code section there too. Again, this applies for general law cities and all counties. If you do create an independent commission, there's some, in this case, fairly detailed requirements for an independent commission. So you'll want to take a look at that code section before you set it up. If you're a charter city, you can still use advisory commissions and independent commissions and get the same credit that I've been talking about for your hearings and using those commissions, but you're not subject to the same requirements in terms of how you create them. If you do visit www.localredistricting.org, you can find a database of ordinances for different jurisdictions that have adopted commissions, including charter cities, and you might look at that for inspiration. So let's go now to the post-draft map hearings. These are the 2 to 3 post-draft map hearings. There is a limitation on timing here. Obviously, you need census data out before you can draw a draft map, but there's also in state law a little bit of a waiting period before you begin to draw those maps. So the requirement is you need to wait 21 days after the release of state adjusted census data. So a state agency, the statewide database, is going to take the census data and it's going to make some modifications to it. And then that data will be used at the state level and by cities and counties. So once that data is released, that's when the clock for 21 days begins. And then after that, you can start putting out your own draft maps. The reason for that waiting period was intended to allow community groups and organizations to be able to provide their own versions of maps for the city council or board to consider. Often once a draft map has been put out, there's a certain degree of inertia there and it can be very hard to change them except for small changes at the margin. So the idea here was to give the public an opportunity to help shape the process before there is a map that the local government has some level of commitment to. I will note that I saw a lot of discussion in the chat about delay in census. That's at the forefront of everyone's mind and something that everyone's going to be looking at. That waiting period that I talked about, if you've got an early redistricting deadline and the data is quite late, that waiting period can be shrunk to 7 days or eliminated entirely. I've included the code sections that you want to look at, which has the triggers for when that waiting period reduces or goes away. In terms of who can hold them, obviously the city council or board of supervisors can hold those post-draft map hearings. But the only other option is an independent commission. That's again if you've turned over your process to the independent commission. I do want to clarify, if you create an advisory commission, the advisory commission is going to be recommending maps to you. So quite obviously they're going to be holding post-draft map hearings. It's not that they can't do that, they should do that. It's just that you won't get credit towards your 2 minimum hearings. And the reason for that is you want the state law structured so that public hearings are done by the deciding body. So in this case, either the city council or board or the independent commission. In terms of hearing locations and times, there are a few things to keep in mind. If you use physical locations, I wonder if everything will be remote this year, but physical locations do need to be ADA accessible. For the most part, city halls, things like that will, I'm sure, are already ADA accessible. You may wish to hold hearings outside of city halls, so it's more accessible to other communities. If you do so, just make sure the building you choose is accessible to all persons. When you hold your hearing, you could either do a standalone hearing just on redistricting, so a public hearing just on the subject of redistricting, or you can roll it into a larger meeting. So a regular meeting, it could just be an agenda item. If you do choose particularly the latter approach, do keep in mind though that the redistricting hearing has to start at a fixed time. So you're going to provide notice of the time of meeting, and that's when that hearing has to start. So if redistricting public hearing is item 25 on your agenda and it's supposed to start at 3 p.m. And you're only at item 20 when 3 p.m. starts, you're allowed to finish any item you're on when the time hits, but then as soon as that item is complete, you then have to go straight to your redistricting public hearing. So that fixed start time is going to be something to keep in mind. And of course, that was put in place so that people don't show up at a public meeting and wait 3 to 4 hours before the redistricting agenda item could come up. It's intended to give a little bit more predictability to the public. There's one last requirement to keep in mind on timing, and that's one of your 4 hearings, and it can be any one that you choose, has to happen outside of normal business hours. So that means after 6 p.m. or on weekends. The goal here is so that people who work 9 to 5 jobs have at least one opportunity to participate in this process. As mentioned, that can be one of your pre-draft map hearings, that can be one of your post-draft map hearings, but that also applies if you choose to have, an advisory commission or staff take one of the workshops. You could choose to have that be the meeting that's held at 6 p.m. So have a staff workshop at the beginning of your process at 6 p.m. and you've met that requirement. In terms of hearing notice, there is requirement for a little bit more advanced notice than the Brown Act traditionally provides. So there does need to be 5-day notice of hearings. This is just notice though. So this does not include a requirement of putting out an agenda, but it does mean date, time, location for the public hearing. And if you're getting very close to your deadline, which is defined as the last 27 days, then it just reduces to 3 days, normal to the Brown Act. So in those last days, you do still have flexibility, but if you're before that, the goal is that you provide a longer period of notice. I want to go back briefly to the website requirement of having a calendar of your hearings. One thing to keep in mind is if in that calendar you list the date, time, and location on the calendar, then that will meet your 5-day notice requirement. So really that calendar is intended to be very useful for the public, but also for you. So long as you keep your calendar updated and it's more than 5 days before the relevant hearing, that's really all you need to do in terms of notice. Now, one of the other things that is significantly different than previously is a requirement for live translation. So at any of your public hearings, if a request is made at least 72 hours in advance, you have to provide live translation. And that is only, though, in your jurisdiction's applicable languages. So not any languages, only certain ones that apply to your jurisdiction. For counties, that's your Section 203 languages. So the languages that you already have to translate ballots into, that's the same languages that you'll have to provide accessibility of live translation upon request. And that's also the languages that you'll need to post online through the Secretary of State templates. For cities, it's going to be based on the percentage of your population that's non-English speaking, based on a special tab that's been requested of the Census Bureau. The Secretary of State will be posting cities' translation, applicable languages at this website. In terms of your draft maps, just recall that the law does specify that the public has to have the ability to submit testimony and draft maps in writing and electronically. It would probably make sense on your website to have an email address or web form where that can be done. And do keep in mind that the public can submit draft maps to you at any time. So the restriction on releasing draft maps only applies to the city and county, not the public. And that's because the goal is for the public to provide you with their suggestions before you develop your own. In terms of maps actually produced by the city or county, if you have demographic information available, that does need to be on the map. So this would include total population, citizen voting age population of the districts, and certain ethnic population. If you have that, it will be included within the map. So your demographer will just include that automatically. If you're doing this yourself and you don't have access to that demographic data, then this requirement doesn't apply to you. It's only if you have that data. And then the last thing I want to say on the draft maps, you can consider draft maps at any time, you can modify them at any time, but your final draft maps, meaning that last draft map that you are going to adopt, that needs to be posted 7 days in advance before you adopt it. So just that very last map that you're going to adopt needs to be 7 days online posting before it's adopted. But even that in the last 27 days, so if you're getting close to your deadline, that'll reduce back down to 3 days. So as you get closer, a lot of these requirements shrink down to give cities and counties flexibility to meet deadlines. The last thing I want to go over is some of the record keeping requirement. You do need to either record your public hearings or do a written summary. And the statute does say of each comment and deliberation. It is just a summary, not a transcript, but do keep that in mind as you're putting that together. And then that needs to either be posted or linked to your redistricting webpage that we talked about at the outset. We talked about some of the other materials that you already have to post, but just remember calendars, agendas, notices, recordings, draft maps, final maps, all those either have to be posted or linked to that redistricting webpage. And finally, the last requirement to keep in mind is that webpage needs to be maintained for 10 years, so the life of the redistricting cycle. That's really kind of an important record keeping thing. If you do ultimately get sued over your lines, this will have a lot of the records to help justify the decisions that you made. So it's also good to have that up there for that reason. With that, I have kind of completed it. I wish you all really good luck. There are a fair number of requirements, but a lot of them are things that if you just plan in advance for and have a little checklist, it should be able to be done. So I wish you all good luck. I'll take questions once my co-panelists have presented, and thank you all so much for having me.
Great. Thank you, Nicolas. Appreciate it. Next, we'll hear from Jonathan on the best practices for community engagement. Jonathan, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Can someone confirm they're seeing the presentation slide and not the, great, fantastic. Okay, so thank you to Nicolas for sharing all of the legal requirements involved in local redistricting processes. I'm going to talk about what you need to do in order to truly engage your community in this transformative experience in your local politics. And that means best practices for community engagement and outreach. First, the main takeaway of everything I'm going to share is you have to get beyond the same 10 to 100 people who seem to take part in every single conversation your city or your county has. We all know these people. They are at every city council meeting, they're at every planning commission meeting, they're at every single charter commission meeting, or whatever the case may be. Depending on the size of your city, it might be 5 people, 15 people, or 100 people. And you need to get the news of redistricting well past those folks so that all corners of the community are participating and making their voices heard. So how can you do that? First, you want to overwhelm the community with outreach, publicity, and education. Please keep in mind, this is a topic that does not come naturally to most folks. It feels technical, it feels esoteric, it feels wonky. In reality, it makes a huge difference in people's lives, but they need to hear about it over and over and over before they're going to actually get involved, okay? So start as early as you can. That delay in redistricting data is going to create some complications for you, but it also means you have months to do education in the community so people know what redistricting is and how to get involved when the map drawing starts. Use social media, that's an easy one. Make sure to distribute your publicity materials to local media of all kinds. That means going beyond your community newspaper to non-English media, ethnic media, community newsletters, blogs, and so on. And also in this COVID era, try to use other sort of digital ways to reach people. I know that's harder. One idea is sending a mailer with translations to every household or in a utility bill. You can use school marquees and other highly visible posting locations in the community. And you can do presentations to community groups virtually or hopefully someday in 2021 in person. And you can do tabling at community events if they're open in your community. One key point though about the best practices outreach or a best practice around outreach is you don't want to just do the, hey, here's when the hearing is, here's how you can get involved, here's where you show up, or here's how you make public comment. You want to share the why of why redistricting matters. As I said before, this will feel esoteric, it will feel complicated. You need to explain to people that this process of drawing district lines that maybe they've never heard of before actually impacts representation in their community. It determines whether they're going to have their voices heard the next decade and whether the community is going to have its needs met, right? So lead with the why before you get to the what, where, when, and how. With respect to hearings, make them as accessible as possible. We urge you, go well beyond the 4 hearings that are required by law, particularly if you're a medium or large size city. 4 hearings will be badly inadequate. Hold all hearings if possible. In the evenings and on weekends so that people who have regular jobs are better able to attend. And hold hearings if you're doing them in person in different parts of town so that no one has to have access to transit or a car in order to make it. In some of the larger cities and counties, making it to the county seat or making it to City Hall is not possible for everyone. So make sure that you have one in every part of town. One good rule of thumb is hold 1 hearing in every existing district, right? If you are going to do them remotely though, please make sure to dedicate a specific hearing to each part of town. What you don't want to happen is residents of one part of town who are highly engaged in your local politics already come out to every single hearing and dominate the voices of everybody else, right? So if you create hearings that are specific to a particular part of town, you're going to make sure that everyone's voices have some space. Make sure to gather public input and testimony outside of hearings. Your hearings are not your only avenue to hear from the community. And if you've been doing outreach for your city or for your county, you know that this is true. Pull out all the stops here for the redistricting process. Send your staff or your consultants, if you have them, to gather input from community groups. Meet people where they are, and instead of expecting people to come to you. Hold pop-up events hold pop-ups at community events. So if there's a farmer's market, or if there's a festival, or if there's a night out for the community, or whatever the case may be, set up a table where you have, let's say, for example, draft maps on big poster board on easels, so people can see, oh, here are the 5 maps that are under consideration. Which one seems to speak to my needs? Which one keeps my community whole in a particular district. Or bring surveys with you, bring iPads where people can respond to a short survey about what they want out of the redistricting process, right? So as I said before, meet people where they are. Another is to issue that survey all over your social media so that you're gathering maybe lower touch but higher volume feedback from the community, right? So there are some folks who aren't going to have the opportunity to come to redistricting hearings because of family obligations or work obligations, but you can still get their input if you create a survey, a quick survey with low barriers to entry, and you spread it through your social media. And make map drawing technology and software available to the public. We're going to hear a lot about that, I think, over the course of the day today, but you want to make tools available to the public so the power of the pen is in the hands of just your demographer or just your city council or whomever. But you also want to make clear to folks, right? Drawing an entire district, and certainly drawing an entire district map, can be very intimidating for regular community members who are coming to redistricting for the first time. Make clear to them that they don't have to do that in order to participate. If all they want to do is they want to map their community of interest and they want to submit that to you, or they just want to map their district, that's okay. Now, you'll have to educate them about the fact that there's lots of different factors that have to be taken into account. If they draw a district, that has all sorts of implications for the districts that neighbor their district, but hopefully they'll understand that. Okay, you want to make sure to reach community members and groups that are not engaged typically in your local governmental processes. Publicize in less engaged neighborhoods. Go beyond your standard Facebook account, your Twitter account, and your Nextdoor account, and use social media accounts that are primarily used in immigrant communities, limited English-speaking communities, communities of color, and other, right? WhatsApp is hugely popular in the Indian American community. Also, it's sometimes in the Latino community. WeChat is really popular in the Chinese American community. Reach people where they're at and translate your social media outreach if it's necessary. In fact, translate all of your outreach materials and use local ethnic media outlets. We did research over the course of the summer we did focus groups with limited English speaking voters, first-time voters, low propensity voters, and they really emphasized for us in mid-2020 that they need to hear about important civic events and civic processes from trusted messengers. They need to hear it from community organizations or from ethnic media or from influencers on their social media channels, right? So find those people and ask them to partner with you on redistricting. And if they're going to be doing some of your outreach for you, don't ask them to do it for free, right? Even small forms of compensation, small grants, for example, can build big buy-in. And then lastly, our research in those focus groups from 2020 really emphasized that for first-time voters, limited English-speaking voters, people on the margins of our democracy, outreach materials that use graphics, images, and visuals are much preferred over highly text-heavy materials, even if that text is really informative and carries important information. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you, and I'm happy to take questions when my co-panelists are complete.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Randi Joel and her experience as a city clerk and what she's planning to do for public engagement. Take it away, Randi.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this morning, and it's certainly a pleasure to serve on the panel with both Nicolas and Jonathan. So we know that, and currently I serve as the legislative director and city clerk for the city of Temecula, as well as the new executive director for the city's Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Commission. So we're very excited about the work that our community has been doing that is indirectly related to redistricting and community engagement as well. So this particular portion of the presentation is really designed to put the practitioner's practical lens based on our community specific. So just to get you thinking out of the box of, okay, you've heard about the law, you've heard about best practices. Now in your community, what does this look like? What could it look like? What I'll try to do is, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the requirements. I'm going to connect for you how the requirements are going to be applicable in, for example, my community in the city of Temecula. What we know is out of the 482 cities, every single city is different. Every single city has different economic resources, has different staffing resources, has different technology resources, has different community makeup. So you can start thinking about how some of this could apply to your city, regardless of whether you're in rural Central Valley or whether you're a coastal city in Northern California, or whether you're located like we are in Southwest Riverside County. So with respect to the 4 public hearings before final map adoption, Nicolas went over the specifics of that. As you mentioned, one of the public hearings has to be before the maps are drawn, 2 of them have to be after they're drawn. We know, looking at our agendas, our city council meets twice a month. So this is something that we are going to go ahead and start in early March. We are already almost done with January. We've got some subcommittee work to do in February, and our calendar on redistricting is going to start March 1st. And that's just for us. You might want to think about doing something different, but as I go through this presentation, you'll understand why I'm going to need all the time that I can get. Our city council meets only twice a month. Our boards and commissions, which we're going to be doing a little stint through them. Planning Commission meets twice a month, but all of our other commissions only meet once a month. Before we even get to these public hearings, we're already going to be out in the city circuit, right? So these public hearings are a few months down the road, but we've got pre-redistricting meetings that are going to be calendared because, as Jonathan said, redistricting, you have to introduce it in our community. So we want to get people's juices flowing, knowing, hey, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. So long before these public hearings even come into play, we're going to have other just meetings. So meetings, workshops, period. He talked a little bit about public hearing locations have to be ADA accessible. Obviously, let's think differently about city hall. Most of our city halls are ADA accessible, but so are our community rec centers. In our city, we have a senior center that is accessible in one location in one district. We have a community rec center that is located in the middle of the city that is ADA accessible. We have a teen center, these kinds of things that we can go ahead and think about. And then let's think about who are our partners, who are our stakeholders. We can have, actually for us, we have Pechanga is located right on the outskirts of our city. But a lot of their employees, residents, visitors, they all live in Temecula Valley. So we might end up asking them to participate and use one of their halls and see if that might be a way that we can actually build that stakeholder relationship as well as with our Chamber of Commerce, and of course, as always, our school districts. With respect to the hearings have to begin at a notice time. You'll recall that a lot of our cities, at the mayor's discretion, or whoever might be running the meeting, the vice mayor, the mayor, a lot of times we move up items on the agenda. So for example, if you have your particular hearing scheduled under public hearings portion of your agenda at the mayor's discretion, and you've noticed it to begin, let's say our council meetings begin at 7 o'clock, you can always, at the mayor's discretion, she can call the meeting to order, he can call the meeting to order and say, at the mayor's discretion, we're going to go ahead and start with our public hearing item. Even if it's lower on your agenda in writing, as long as you have associated that particular portion of the meeting is starting at 7 o'clock, then we can go ahead and do that. Or on your agenda, simply after roll call and all those calling the meeting to order and flag salute and all that, just start your public hearing right away, and you can actually put that on your agenda as well. So Nicolas talked a little bit about you can hold public workshops in lieu of public hearings. That's again optional. And then the option of the Advisory Redistricting Commission to hold hearings. So I want to talk a little bit about what the city of Temecula is actually doing in this space. We do not anticipate creating an independent redistricting commission. We also do not anticipate creating an advisory redistricting commission. For a variety of reasons, the legislative body of our city is anticipated to go ahead and hold those hearings themselves. However, we do have a fantastic opportunity to engage all of our existing boards and commissions. The city currently has 5 boards and commissions. We have an Old Town Local Review Board, which is in one district, does a lot of work in one district. And then the 4 other commissions, which do work citywide. So obviously, Planning Commission, Community Services Commission, Public Traffic Safety Commission, and our Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Commission. So let me talk to you about why we felt it's very important to go through all of these commissions. As we're trying to understand our communities of interest. For example, it's important to go before the Planning Commission because the Planning Commission may have knowledge of a development that is coming up in the next few years. And we want to be cognizant of not having to split that development up. If that's going to be an HOA, if that's going to be surrounding a park, we want to make sure to the extent possible, that might be a community of interest that we want to keep together. Community Services Commission. A lot of things that come up before them is parks and programs and services. If they're going to have programs and services that are designed to serve a particular group, community sect of the group of the community in a particular location, we want to know about that. If there's going to be a park that is planned or programming that is going to happen at a particular park, we want to know about that because we want to make sure that we can actively engage that portion of the constituency and actually be notified of whatever noticing and all that kind of stuff, engagement that those folks are going to be doing in that space as well. And of course, our what we refer to as our REDI Commission. So I'll refer to it as the REDI Commission for the rest of the presentation, our Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Commission. And that particular commission is specifically working on recommendations to the City Council in that particular space of diversity and equity and inclusion. So they are going to be intimately involved with the redistricting process. And the 7 members that serve on that particular commission represent all kinds of groups in our community, right? They represent school district, they represent realtors, they represent the chamber, they represent teachers, they represent just outside stakeholders. And if we can engage them, then they will be communicating this messaging out as well. So underrepresented non-English speaking communities in Riverside County, it's primarily English and Spanish, but we don't want to stop there. We want to go ahead and working with our PIO, who communicates with all of Riverside County and even beyond and statewide, right? So our PIO happens to be in Capio and will be able to help us along this way with regards to engaging underrepresented non-English speaking communities, as well as media organizations. In the summer, we had a lot of protests in our community. So a lot of our good government groups, civil rights groups, civic engagement groups, community groups, some of them that we had never heard of from before, they're now actively engaged in our city. And we want to make sure that we capitalize on those good relationships that we've been building since this last summer to keep them engaged throughout the redistricting process as well. We'll also be, we have a great relationship with our Riverside Registrar of Voters office. So we'll be working with them as well, asking what media organizations that they utilize and how they go ahead and reach specifically their underrepresented non-English speaking communities. And then one of the things that is really important in this space is your commissioners, your council members, staff members in City Hall may be familiar with particular community groups or civic engagement groups, specifically associated with particular ethnicities and cultural backgrounds. So I'll give you the example of, for me, as an Indian American, I am very aware of the Sikh Association and those particular Punjabi related groups that provide information through social media and otherwise. So for me, I know that particular group, I can engage in that space. I have some staff members who are also familiar with LULAC, MALDEF, so there might be some opportunities there. So just think outside of the box of who might be able to connect you with these particular communities and how you can advance those relationships. Translations, I won't spend a lot of time on that. As Nicolas alluded to, the Secretary of State has a fabulous resource, so there will be a lot of cutting and pasting. Public testimony, we have to accept that in the maps need to be in writing and electronically. Well, the good news is we do a lot of this work already. Think about your CDBG. Our CDBG notices are already in multiple languages, you know, and think about who works in that space and which consultants, vendors, or in-house staff that they use for that particular process, because it's very similar to that. We already accept a multitude of things in writing and electronically, so this is just one more thing on that. Public comments and council deliberation, the recording or written summary within 2 weeks requirement. A lot of us already do this, right? A lot of us already video record or audio record our public meetings. So think about how you can add links to your redistricting page for that particular meeting or for that particular discussion. And maybe even go one step beyond and go ahead and add the video or add the recording so that it's narrowed down to that particular place on the agenda. And then with respect to the internet and website, I know it looks like a lot. When I will tell you, as a practitioner, when we were first going through the AB 849 1276 discussions, and I know either Jonathan or Nicolas can probably attest to this, is I was scared. I was like, oh no, what are we doing here? This is a lot. This is a lot. But as we engaged, we knew that some of this stuff we were already doing. Some of this, there were elements of this, and maybe not necessarily with districting or redistricting, but with other community development related programs and services, we were already doing some of this. A lot of this, the templates are going to be available from the Secretary of State's office. So there's going to be a lot of cut and paste. And then my suggestion, I'm going to end up actually doing a standard calendar, our timeline of how we expect to engage pre and during and post redistricting. And then every time there's a change to that, I'm just going to switch out the calendar online so that the community can anticipate what the process is going to be and how long it's going to take.
And Randy, would it be all right if we switch to a question and answer time? Would that be all right?
Yeah. This is actually my last slide. I'm going to just really quickly. I know we're running behind. Just really think about your working with your registrar of voters, other people inside City Hall, folks that you would work in the business and residential community through, your realtors group, your chamber groups, all of that. Your current and previous candidates for elections, engage them in redistricting, let them know what's going on, and then just make sure that you share those efforts with your GOT efforts as well. Zach, I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. No, thank you so much, Randy. Really appreciate it. And that was very, very thorough. And I'm so grateful for you, Nicolas and Jonathan. Thank you so much for everything you provided. And we're just going to transition to a few minutes of questions from members who've been attending. And just a reminder to everyone who's been in attendance, feel free to paste in your questions in the chat box and we'll do our best to attend to those. But I'm going to start with our first question. This one is to Nicolas, and it says the following, and it's from Tammy Vaughn. In the event the demographer finds that the boundaries have not changed, are we still required to go through the redistricting process / requirements?
Yeah, you are. So even if your population has not changed, you need to adopt a new map after the census, and this is the process that you do in adopting a map.
Great. Next question, it says, what would you advise a city or county who might want to consider an independent redistricting commission this cycle? How about Jonathan for that?
I would say move quickly because particularly if you use the June 2022 primary, you really do need to get moving. The application process should be held open for at least a month so people can get their applications in, and then you have to have an evaluation process. So it's going to take you a while. If you're going to make that choice, I would urge you to be expedient about it. Go to localredistricting.org where you can find tons of resources on how to set up a Redistricting Commission, including, and I think this is fantastic, a ordinance generator that walks you through all the policy choices you have to make when setting up an independent commission, and then it spits out an ordinance for you based on all of your choices.
Great. Randi, this one will be for you. It's from Tejal Shah, says following: can any of the speaker, can you provide advice on how to outreach and hold sessions that include underserved communities remotely?
Yeah, so we're actually, the best thing for is to make sure you identify some of those leaders. So for example, in a previous city, we had a huge Farsi and a Punjabi speaking community. So as some of the leaders of those particular churches, gurdwaras, mosques, they know their particular communities and how best to reach them, and they'll be able to help you with that virtual information delivery as well.
Great, thanks so much. This one for Jonathan, can you confirm that a fully remote meeting is acceptable, and what are some other ways that jurisdictions can improve the accessibility of the redistricting process, particularly in remote meetings? And Randi and Nicolas, after Jonathan answers, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, remote meetings will meet your requirements. I think there's a couple things you want to do, though, to make sure that remote meetings are accessible. First, if at all possible, offer a hybrid system in which some people who are on the wrong side of the digital divide and cannot access a remote meeting do have some place they can go in person to participate or observe. You want to make public comment as easy as possible in the remote setting. So you want to make sure that you accept written comment and verbal live public comment at the hearing itself, and you want to lower barriers to participation. So don't ask people to sign up a day in advance or 2 days in advance. Allow people to make themselves present and raise their hand to participate in the moment. And don't have forms, complicated forms that act as barriers. And lastly, if you're going to go remote, make sure to provide closed captioning to ensure accessibility.
Great. Randi or Nicolas, anything you would like to add on that one? Nope, perfect. Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Those are all the questions that we have for this panel. And I'd like to thank the panelists once again, Nicolas, Randi, Jonathan. You guys were fantastic and very grateful for everything you provided today. So thank you for everything. And now we're just going to carry on into our next category. And this is going to be dealing with mapping. And I just want to move forward on that. So a discussion that will be moderated by Lori Shellenberger, who will introduce our esteemed speaker. Lori Shellenberger is a voting rights, election reform, and redistricting expert who consults with state and national organizations working to build a more inclusive democracy. She currently serves as a redistricting advisor to Common Cause's California and national redistricting teams. Go for it, Lori.
Thank you so much, Zach, and good morning, everyone. It's really exciting to see so many people participating in this training today and all the great questions that you've had. So we'll try to keep up with those and continue to post your questions in the chat as we proceed with this panel, and we'll try to answer those at the end of our discussion. And I have the privilege today of talking with Karin MacDonald, who is the director of California's statewide database, and that's the redistricting database for the state of California. Under Karin's direction, the statewide database became the first transparent, publicly available redistricting database in the US. And she also serves as the state of California's liaison to the Census Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. She's a member of the National Conference of State Legislatures Standing Committee on Redistricting and Elections. And she also serves on their Redistricting and Elections Policy Working Group. Many of you probably know Karin because she's assisted lots of cities and school districts with the transition to district elections over the last decade and assisted with redistricting. She's the owner of Q2 Data and Research, a small nonpartisan consulting firm specializing in redistricting, voting rights, and election administration projects. And she also was the consultant to the California State Independent Redistricting Commission in 2011. Her approach to redistricting focuses on transparency and collaboration. I'm going to ask Karin today some questions about approaches to mapping and the available technology and expertise that cities and counties should consider when they engage in redistricting. And again, we've reserved time for questions, so please keep those coming. So Karin, I'm going to start and kick this off with the first question. State law requires local governments to use state adjusted census data for their redistricting. And first, I'd love for you to explain what that is and how and when cities and counties get that data. We've already been getting questions about that given the delays and yesterday's announcement by the Census Bureau that confirming the delay would be pushing the data into July. We also had a question before you talk about state adjusted data. Can you also just briefly describe what census data is? Because we had a question earlier in the chat asking if the census would account for all the moving and the deaths, due to COVID, and how does that impact the census data? So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lori, for that kind introduction. And it's really nice to see everybody. Thank you very much, Zach, Kathy, Lori, everybody for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here and see so many familiar and friendly faces. So it's nice to spend some time with all of you. I put a couple of slides together for the adjustment, and I understand that somebody has control of this. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, whoever is working the slides in the background. I appreciate it. Could we please go to the first slide? And I will start talking about census data, and then we'll move into this adjusted census data issue. So the census is supposed to count people where they are on April 1st of 2020. So some of the mobility, of course, may have already happened, people may have moved already before 2020, before April 1, 2020, and some people were probably moving afterwards. We know there was a lot of mobility. We know people were displaced. We know that students, in particular, student populations are kind of critical right now and very, very difficult for the census to deal with because they're supposed to be counted at the universities, but many of them moved home to their parents. There's a question about whether or not the parents put them on the census form. A lot of people actually moved just around April 1, but in general, you're supposed to fill out the census form based on where your residence is, where you're really regularly living as of April 1, 2020. So there are definitely some struggles that the census is dealing with. And Lori, does that address the question, or would you like me to go into more detail?
No, I think that's helpful for folks.
Yeah, and I'm happy to go into more detail if people would please just ask in the chat what they would like to see addressed, then I can go into that later. But let's talk about what the adjusted census data are. So many of you who have been around for census data releases have heard the term adjusted census data. This time around, we're using it a little differently. Usually we used to talk about adjusted data to talk about the undercount, where there are people that were missed and so forth. And then there was always this hullabaloo about whether or not the census was going to be able to adjust the data to account for an undercount later. And that's not what we're talking about here right now. California now has a law that requires cities and counties to redistrict using adjusted census data. So you have to use total population that were released by the census. And that, of course, is the data set that we found out yesterday will be even more delayed than we had already anticipated. And then it will be adjusted by taking into account people that are incarcerated, taking them out of the location where they were enumerated, and then reallocating them to their last known residential address. So I'm going to just read this really quickly. So this is section 21003. It says that an incarcerated, this is election code section, an incarcerated person shall not be counted toward a city's population except for an incarcerated person whose last known place of residence may be assigned to a census block in the city if information about the last known place of residence for incarcerated persons is included in the computerized database for redistricting that is developed in accordance with subdivision B and so forth. Could we please go to the next slide? Thank you. So this slide kind of summarizes what this means. It means that my project, the Statewide database up at Berkeley, which is the official redistricting database for the state, we are responsible for adjusting the census data. We've been working with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation for quite a few years to make sure that we get a good data set from them. And the database is going to be responsible for taking the data that we got from the Department of Corrections. So it's a database that gives us the people that were incarcerated on April 1 of 2020. So on Census Day, when the enumeration, of course, with the census parallel was happening. And we are taking the people that were enumerated in facilities that were under their control. Those people have their last residential addresses, if we're lucky. And then those addresses are basically going to be used to allocate and adjust the census data. So think about it as in, we take them out of the facility under control of the CDCR, and we put them back into their residential address. So what is the effect of that? The effect of that is that if you have a facility in your jurisdiction that's under the control of the CDCR, and I keep on using that terminology because you should note that federal prisons, for example, or county jails are not part of this legislation, okay? So it's really just people that were under the control of CDCR, and we're talking about roughly 120-something thousand people. And those folks are being taken out of that facility, so that facility will basically be pretty much close to zero, and then they will be sprinkled, so to speak, to their previous residential address throughout the state of California. So the biggest effect is going to be on the location where that facility is, and then there will be a smaller effect on the various cities and counties where these people will be allocated. So we're obviously not really moving them. This is an adjustment to the data. People will still be incarcerated. And so what you'll see is just a slight adjustment to the census data on the receiving end, and a larger adjustment to the census data if you have a facility in your jurisdiction. So where are the data going to be available? They will be available on our website at statewidedatabase.org. And on the first slide, and of course we are sending all of the slides out after this presentation. So you'll have the website there. You don't necessarily have to jot it down right now. We usually have all kinds of different data sets available. We're working on a landing page that will make it easier for you. So we will have the counties that will say, here's your county data set. We will have the cities. It will say, here's your city data set. We'll basically take this statewide data set and we will parse it out so that it's easier for you to download it. And there will be a download in different formats so that you can import it into your systems fairly easily. One caveat here is that if you are doing your own redistricting, if you don't have a consultant who will obviously know this, please make sure that when you're buying redistricting software that your vendor did not put a different data set into your redistricting software. I am working with all of the vendors that are out there, but usually what they do, what the vendors do, the redistricting software creators, is they just take the census data from the census and they import it into their data set. That would create a problem because you would be using different totals for almost every jurisdiction in the state of California, because that's just not the data set you are supposed to use. You are supposed to use the data set from the statewide database. And in terms of when the data are going to be available, I know Lori just mentioned that you talked about the delays of the census data. At this point, the census says that we should not be expecting the census data to be released before July 30. They did not say expected on July 30. So I think they left the door very, very wide open for the census data to be released even later than that. And which of course could create quite a bit of problems, and that's not the topic of this conversation, luckily. But either way, the way to think about when these data are going to be available is to think about release of census data plus 30 days, because we need 30 days to adjust the data And we will also be bringing other data sets into the statewide database data set. So that takes us 30 days. So that is pretty much my summary on that.
And just so folks know, there are a couple of release dates that get thrown around. April 30th is the apportionment data, and then the demographic data that's used for redistricting is that July 30th working date right now. And we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that when the legislature adjusted the primary in order to account for the census delays, that they also built in contingencies that Nicolas touched on in his presentation for the data being released even later. And we have a chart that we've developed at Common Cause that outlines all of this for you, and we'll be sending that out to you next week. That will be on Common Cause's website as well, along with the recording of this webinar and all of these PowerPoints, that wonderful PowerPoints and presentations. So, but we're trying to create working documents that will help you sort this out and understand these timelines so that you can meet your deadline. Karin, you talked about jurisdictions who may do this themselves. I know, some jurisdictions are smaller than others and their budgets are tight, but I'd love if you could talk to folks about the importance of having a redistricting consultant and what role they play in the adjustment of boundaries and engaging the public in the process.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Lori. I put a little slide together if the wonderful person in the background would, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I put a slide together that just kind of shows some of the tasks that a redistricting consultant does. And I thought it might be interesting to see for people because oftentimes redistricting consultants are referred to as line drawers, which kind of sounds like all they're doing is just adjusting geography for you, but there is actually quite a bit that goes into what a redistricting consultant does. And I don't want this to be understood as an advertisement for hiring a redistricting consultant, okay? I want to be really clear about that. I understand that a lot of people have capabilities that may match all of the tasks that have to be done. Other people may not have them. They may not want to deal with this. So this is just a little outline so you can take a look at this. I personally think that for a lot of jurisdictions, it's not a bad idea to at least have somebody perhaps on retainer that they can ask some questions just to make sure that things work all right. I have personally had that experience with a couple of clients in 2011, and that seemed to be a very happy median that worked, where they knew they could call and just ask some questions and make sure that they were doing the right thing, because there are actually quite a bit of, there are quite a few potholes that you could potentially step into. So let me just go through this pretty quickly. So one is a good redistricting consultant should be able to help you with your criteria and criteria implementation. And I don't know if you've talked about the Fair Maps Act, but I'm guessing that it's come up. It's pretty clear now which criteria you should be using. And
we have a panel on that right after this.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. So this will all become much clearer once you're listening to that panel after this particular presentation. So criteria, there have been books written about criteria and how to implement them. And sometimes they're very straightforward and sometimes they're just not. So a good redistricting consultant can help you with that, because for the state, criteria are ranked, which means, you take them, you figure out what they are, and then you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But generally speaking, you don't have that luxury of having somebody tell you do this and then do this. These criteria, they all interact. So it becomes very interesting very quickly. Other things that consultants do, redistricting consultants do, is they can help with planning the process. And that may be something you can do in-house. Again, it depends on what your capacity is. And implementing all of the requirements, and there are many. There are many, many, many. They create and set up a redistricting data set. Now, of course, you've heard that the Statewide database, my project at Berkeley that we make a redistricting data set available, but for local jurisdictions, there may be some tweaks. There may be some data that you want to import, and that is something that a redistricting consultant would also do for you. They can help with drafting of materials and presentations, setting up and populating a project website, and then tools also. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this conversation, of course. So those are online tools, participation tools, so forth. And they answer questions. And I think that's a really important piece. They work with the public to collect data. That can be an important piece, like how do you talk to people about communities of interest? How to get people to participate? Some larger jurisdictions have the, the budgets to perhaps hire a separate outreach consultant. But I have to say that I have worked with outreach consultants, and many of them are very, very good at what they do. This is still very specialized. So it is a different way, a different topic, a different way of talking to people to elicit information about where people's communities of interest are, to get people to wrap their heads around it and to really have them fully participate in the process. It really is a little bit of a different animal altogether. Most importantly, I would say that a good consultant will help you with Voting Rights Act assessments and implementation. That is definitely not straightforward. You may need a racially polarized voting analysis depending on where you're sitting. And you want to make sure that you do this right, because there is a lot of opportunity to end up in court, and many jurisdictions have ended up in court over this. So it's a good thing to have somebody help you with this. Finally, a redistricting consultant would work with your in-house counsel. I think for most jurisdictions, you don't really need specialized counsel, even though it may sound daunting. A good redistricting consultant can help you with the implementation of pretty much everything. And, and then they also construct districts. They do the line drawing. And I know that for some jurisdictions, you may have a very good GIS department. GIS department may not have the right software available, or perhaps, draw lines differently. I mean, line drawing is just, again, it's a very specialized, niche kind of an area of expertise. And then again, here's my little note that when people say that they hired a line drawer, what they're really saying is that they hired somebody who does all of this stuff that I just listed above. So I do think that that is something to consider. And it's also, of course, something to consider to really make sure you get somebody who can work with you, who has the approach that you want to implement in mind, and somebody you really can work with. So that's my 5 cents on that. And Lori, please ask if you wanted me to cover anything else on that topic.
I think that's great. And we had a great question from someone in the chat. Will McClintock asked about whether there are times where the public draws the maps, right? So that kind of leads into the next question I had, which is what software and technology is out there? And it's just, we can all geek out here, but it's really exciting to see the new stuff available because it's so accessible and easy to use. And can you share what available software is out there, why it's important to make that available to the public? And in response to Will's question, how do those public submissions, how do those interact with a consultant or whoever may be drawing the lines for a jurisdiction?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, it's one of my favorite questions. So thank you very much, Will, for asking that. There are different ways by which the public can be involved in drawing lines. I think that also depends on the approach that your jurisdiction will take, and perhaps the approach that your redistricting consultant brings to the table. From personal experience, I can tell you that I've had quite a few jurisdictions where the public drew the lines in public, where we developed lines together in community meetings with redistricting consultant, basically just managing the software and people giving suggestions about what the lines should look like and what should go into which district. And in that collaborative and interactive and completely transparent way, we built a map. And that essentially is kind of also what the Citizens Redistricting Commission did. The commission gave direction, but the public, and this is the state commission, but the public weighed in and gave a lot of suggestions, and the process again happened in public. And so there are various ways to do that. Of course, what Lori just brought up is the question of technology. So can you give people the opportunity to participate in drawing maps on their own and then submitting those maps to a commission? And I would like to go to the next slide and step back a tiny little bit and start with a criterion that's called communities of interest, which is a criterion that's been on the rise, essentially. It's been increasing in importance, I think, nationwide. I love to hear what Kathy has to say about this. I think you probably agree, Kathy, right? There are various ways of eliciting feedback on communities of interest, and I wanted to focus on a little software, a one-trick pony, as I call it, a little software app that we developed at Statewide Database to help the State Commission that allows people to draw their community of interest, which is similar but also different from drawing your own district. And I'll go into this. So I'll give you a little bit of a run through of this tool because it'll help you, I hope, wrap your head around what these software packages and what these public tools could look like. So could we please go to the next slide? So let's remind ourselves really quickly what a community of interest is. And again, this comes straight out of the elections code. So to the extent practicable, the geographic integrity of any local neighborhood, so a neighborhood and a community of interest, so we're already talking about two geographic entities here, right, shall be respected in a manner that minimizes its division. So I put that in bold because I am aware of some jurisdictions where they were advised to split communities of interest to spread them around. That is not what the law says. The law says you are supposed to keep them together and not split them up. So keep that in mind. A community of interest is a population that shares a common social or economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. And then there's a little caveat of what a community of interest is not. And a community of interest does not include relationships with political parties, incumbents, or political candidates. If you followed the State Redistricting Commission and the criteria that we now have in the state constitution since 2008, 2008 was it, Kathy? I think it was 2008. Then all this language looks very familiar to you, because essentially what the Fair Maps Act does is it takes significant sections of the state requirements and then basically now makes them requirements for local redistricting also. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this little one-trick pony, which I hope is not offending all of my developers at Statewide Database, this little one-trick pony allows people to draw their communities. So it's called Draw My CA Community. The Redistricting Commission, the State Redistricting Commission named it that way. We now own a lot of URLs because we had all kinds of other names for it, but at least it's descriptive, even though a little long. So it's drawmycacommunity.org, and it was developed to facilitate public access to the California statewide redistricting process. Users can define their communities of interest and then submit that input directly to the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, the CRC. And our goal was to create something that is free to use, low barrier of entry, and user-friendly. Next slide, please. So you'll see some of the screenshots here, and I'm going to fly through these slides because you'll have them available, and of course you can go on the website and take a look at it. You can create an account versus being a guest user, so you don't have to tell anybody who you are. You can still use it. You can save your work if you did create an account, and then you can return to it later. And guest users can also access the tool without logging in. They don't have to provide anything. They can still submit their community of interest. They can also download it. And next slide, please. The home screen looks like this. Users basically define their community, and then they locate their community. They do this by locating their community. They create a little community of interest via the map area. Next, please. And yes, the COIs are self-identified. I just saw this little chat here pop up. Yes, they are self-identified. And that is, in fact, the goal of this tool, is to allow people to self-identify. You know, if you think about it, the census has a lot of data available, in particular the American Community Survey. There are a lot of data sets available that you could use, and you could make some assumptions about what a community of interest is. And for some areas, that might be a valuable thing to do. For a lot of areas, you're going to want to hear from people on the ground, because, you know, just knowing that people have the same plumbing facilities does not necessarily make them the same community of interest. Or just knowing that people are poor does not mean that they have the same interests when it comes to needing electoral representation. I think you always have to be careful to not go into stereotyping, and you know, the preference is generally to just ask people themselves so that they can tell you what their interests are and what they need out of this process. So that is what this tool is trying to do. It's trying to take a lot of the work out of it, so you're not getting a lot of napkins with little communities on there or lots of pieces of paper. It's trying to streamline things and assist the process and making it to make it a little bit more user-friendly for you, really, for the mappers, but also for the community members. So, and that is essentially also why we're asking for written testimony. Essentially, you're just asked to provide, you know, a name for your community. It could be the dog lovers of Oakland. And then you can tell us about the community. You're asked whether there are some nearby areas you think should be in your district with your community, and you can provide additional comments. So the first two questions are required. So essentially give a name and then tell us about the community, and the rest of it is optional. Next slide, please. And then people draw a community map. They draw that community map on census data, and we have various layers. If you're not familiar with that terminology, a layer is essentially just a different map, and they call them layers because you can kind of put them on top of each other in the mapping software. So we have like one of those layers that are census blocks, and then tracts and tribal areas, places, i.e. that's a census term for cities, and then counties. Next, please.
And Karin, I just want to be mindful, we promised folks a break, so we have to stop in a couple minutes.
We're almost done with this, and then maybe we can take a break.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll fly through this. So this is just like this is just a little map of somebody who drew a community area. Next, please. Please, and then you can save a draft if you want to, and then you can go back and modify it if you did create an account. And then finally, you can export it at any time. You can download the files if you want to. And then here is the caveat, and this is what I wanted you to hear. Even though this tool is created for the state process, and there's a button that says submit it to the commission, they can they can download the data, they can print their map, they can email the map, they can create a PDF of the map, and then they can share that with the local jurisdiction also if they want to. Even though it wasn't designed that way, that is something that is possible. So, you know, it's out there, so people are probably going to use it that way. And we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that there is no confusion about this, about where this map actually goes when you click submit, because it's not magically going to go to you, but this is a tool that could potentially be used. Let's see if I have another slide on this. So when people submit community input, they have an option again to provide their name and contact info, so that people can get back to them. Logged in users can get a PDF. Like I just mentioned, they can print that. They can go to their neighbors and say, hey, Do you agree with this? Should we talk about this? Should we modify it? What do we want to do? And then again, they can download the files if they're guest users, and they can do with it whatever they wish. Again, next slide, please. Only this one slide. If you can believe it, this tool will be available in a minimum of 14 languages. I have listed the languages, and this is actually a pretty unique tool with respect to that. There are other tools floating around. They may not be specific to California. We can talk about this after the break. And again, users will receive a PDF of their community in the language that they used the tool in, and they can export it that way and share it that way. And finally, last slide, please. Happy redistricting. I guess we'll take a break and then perhaps go back to questions. Is that the plan?
Well, we don't actually have time to go back to questions, unfortunately, because we have such a tight schedule and people are asking such great questions. I want to just point out a couple things. First of all, thank you, Karin, and that. But there were lots of questions about how do you define a community of interest? How do you make sure you don't exclude, certain groups? And our next panel is going to talk about that criteria and what it means. So there were a lot of great questions, and I think Justin and Angelo will address those on the next panel. In terms of making sure you aren't excluding communities of interest, you're going to want to make that loops back to your public engagement, right? Is the better your outreach and connection to the community, the more like you are not to exclude folks. The same goes for the question I saw about tech. There was a question about what about people who aren't tech savvy? You want to make sure you're providing lots of mechanisms for people to submit their testimony. Make a video, they can draw it on a napkin, they can describe it in writing. And so that again goes back to those public engagement best practices. And Common Cause has a lot of great resources on that, about how to engage community in that. And those will be on the website. In addition to information about other tools, like there are other tools out there in addition to this amazing app that the statewide database and that tool that they have created. There's Districtor, Representable has a tool. There are lots of things out there. And I know some of our consultants across the state, some of the mapping consultants are working with lots of different folks to make sure that a lot of times the line drawers, redistricting consultants will come with available software that they can make available to the community under a contract with you. So Karin, do you have anything to add to that before?
Yeah, exactly. And thank you, Lori, for summarizing things. I'm sorry, I didn't realize we were running out of time. We definitely need to let you know that this is really just a tool for input of communities of interest. There are other mapping tools, full mapping tools out there. And Lori just mentioned some of them, and I'm sure Common Cause will make some resources available. There are some free mapping tools out there. And when I say mapping tools, I mean public online tools that people can use to create a map of the district, their own district, the entire jurisdiction, and then submit it. I think you're not going to be able to avoid getting maps because these tools are out there, irrespective of whether or not they're going to be your tool for your jurisdiction. So I think it's important to keep abreast of what is out there, who is out there, and what do they make available so that you know what you're looking at when you're getting these submissions. And yes, please keep in mind that there are a lot of people without broadband access. And I heard the last bit of Jonathan Stein's presentation or an answer to a question. It is really, you do have to make sure that you have paper versions, like a questionnaire about community of interest in particular or input available so that people can fill it out. They can mail it someplace, have a mailing address, have a phone number available. People do still use the phone, and just, just take data and maps and input in whatever way it comes your way.
And
So,
Karin,
thank you.
We're going to move to the break, but Karin, if you're willing to hang around for a little bit longer and watch the chat, if there are folks who have questions, let's officially call the break now until 10:55. So please come back at 10:55. We'll start our panel on criteria and voting rights. But for folks who want to ask questions, I know there was a question, Karin, about, I saw earlier about, and I think someone may have missed it, is will the statewide database data be available at the county level?
Yes. Okay. I'll go through the chat and I'll provide some answers over the next 10 minutes or so. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for being here.
All right, hi everyone and welcome back. We have two more panel discussions for you this morning, one on the Voting Rights Act and the other on the nuts and bolts of actually implementing a redistricting process. First, let us hear from our guest speakers that will be discussing the Voting Rights Act and other redistricting criteria in order to ensure equitable representation. They will walk through the Voting Rights Act with tips on not only how to comply, but to build inclusive representation. We'll first hear from Professor Justin Levitt, a nationally recognized expert on constitutional law and the law of democracy at LMU Loyola Law School. And he served from 2015 to 2017 as Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice, helping to lead the Civil Rights Division's work on redistricting, voting rights, and employment discrimination. He maintains the All About Redistricting website and has been invited to testify as an expert before U.S. Senate and House committees, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, state legislative bodies and redistricting commissions, and federal and state court. Next, we'll hear from Angelo Ancheta, who is an attorney and academic who specializes in civil rights, constitutional law, electoral politics, and appellate advocacy. He has practiced law and has been an executive director for nonprofit legal organizations in both Northern and Southern California, and he has taught law at UCLA, Harvard, New York University, and Santa Clara University. He was a member of and chair of the first California Citizens Redistricting Commission, 2011 to 2020, and he has been active in state-level redistricting since the 1990s. So first up, Justin Levitt, take it away.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks very much, Zach. Thanks to Common Cause for pulling this all together. Thanks to all of the clerks and other officials who are on this Zoom call. I've been given the task of trying to talk law at you and to you for about 15 minutes, and then to let Angelo tell you how it actually works on the ground, how it works in practice. The presentation that I'd normally give to the statewide commission on these sorts of legal topics is about 3 hours, and I've got 15 minutes. So forgive me if I throw a lot of information your direction. I will try to watch the chat as we go, just as Karin did, just as some of the previous speakers have, to pick up what questions I can in the chat. And like her, I will stay on after I'm done with time in order to answer questions I haven't gotten to. But just because of the volume of stuff I want to at least put in front of you for a first hearing, I'm going to try not to take questions during the 15 minutes unless they're through the chat. I'll see them where I can. With that, let me hope that what you are seeing now is a presentation featuring a face a lot less handsome than I know you'd all hope. If you all can see this, please. Excellent. Thank you, Zach. So the first thing I want to start with is my task today was to talk to you about the Voting Rights Act and other criteria, but I want to make sure that you know that this guy, this face, is not your lawyer. So I'm talking to you about legal claims and legal aspects of federal law, of state law, of local law, but you all have counsel and you should listen to them and not me when they tell you something that's different from what you hear here. That said, the sorts of criteria that you're going to be dealing with, the sorts of criteria you're going to have to consider, are drawn from a couple stable sources. For the most part, that's the federal Constitution, that's the Federal Voting Rights Act. They're criteria newly set in state election law. So some of you have dealt with some of these in the past, but all of you will have to deal with more of them now, thanks to some recent state legislation. And for those of you who are in charter cities, some of these criteria may apply across the board to your charter cities and some may not. Your charters may have different criteria that you're asked to apply. So please understand this is a general overview. It applies to general law cities. It applies to most charter cities. But if you're in a charter city, you may have some different rules that apply to you. Real quickly, an overview. The big constitutional reason that we redistrict is to represent people where they are, to have about the same population in each district, congressional district, state legislative district, and yes, city council districts as well. The population has to be approximately equal, substantially equal. But the law generally allows for about a 10% difference from the largest district to the smallest district. Here's an example. It's very stylized, obviously, and it shows you can count the average population. You can see how big any given district is above or below average, and you can look to see if you're in trouble, if you're running over that 10% line, just by taking the biggest, the largest populated district and the smallest populated district and calculating the difference between them. A caution: leave yourself the flexibility that the law leaves you. Don't try to get the population down much more than this average, because every step you take has trade-offs elsewhere in the redistricting process. And the more you bind your hands in one particular area, the harder you make it on yourself to fulfill all of the other criteria you want to apply. Put differently, the goal here is not perfectly equal population in each district. The goal is substantially equal population, but that involves some flexibility for you to accomplish other things. What other thing? Oh, and before I go on, there's also a new rule in California. This will affect almost all of you. Has to do with how the state and how you will count the incarcerated population. I know there was a question on this in the chat before. As I understand it, the state will attempt to address state correctional institutions and also federal correctional institutions where they know, in order to account for the incarcerated population. Particularly for state institutions, they're going to count people who are incarcerated where they're from, where their legal residence is, which is usually not where they're currently incarcerated. Susanville, California is a great example of why this is important. And they, for a long time, they're up in Lassen County. For a long time, they did this before state law required it. Susanville's non-prison population is heavily non-Hispanic white, 0% African-American, 24% Latinx, and the rest of the town is white. The prison population is very different and about half of the total population in the city. That creates an enormous distortion in local governance. And so for a long time, cities with the sorts of big prison populations that Susanville had addressed this by not including those numbers in their city unless the people who were incarcerated really lived there. The state's going to do that for you this time around. So the statewide database will have the information as best they can. It's tricky to do, but adjusting prison populations based on where people were from before they were incarcerated. Another reason to have this flexibility is to be able to account for rules on race and ethnicity. I've tried to distill this to 3 simple rules, even though this could go on for a lot longer. Rule 1, don't set out to hurt voters based on their race or ethnicity. Don't intentionally crack up minority populations so they're dispersed to a lot of different districts. Don't intentionally overpack minority populations so they're almost all of one district but tokenized with a bleached influence outside of that district. This is unconstitutional, and it doesn't matter if the lines are pretty, it doesn't matter if there's an ultimate other motive. If you are using people based on their race or ethnicity in a way that's designed to hurt them, even if you're trying to accomplish something else, not okay. The second rule, comply with the Voting Rights Act. The Federal Voting Rights Act here, the California Voting Rights Act won't apply if you already have districts or if you're drawing districts. The Federal Voting Rights Act does. And there are 4 sort of simple things to keep in mind. It doesn't apply, you won't always have an obligation under the Federal Voting Rights Act. But if there are sizable and relatively concentrated minority communities, if those communities have distinct electoral preferences, that's not always on a partisan basis, not always whether they vote Democratic or Republican. If there's a pocket of minority population that has distinct preferences in primaries and nonpartisan races and other races like in the city, from the preferences of a majority racial group, and if those underrepresented minorities either did or do face discrimination, chances are good you've got an obligation under the Voting Rights Act. And that obligation is to design districts so that you give the minority populations in your city a fair shot, an equal opportunity to elect the candidates of their choice. There's an enormous amount that goes into each of those basic questions that I'm happy to answer if I've got more time later, and I'm happy to answer in the chat. But there's an enormous amount that goes into this those are the basics for you to keep in mind in complying with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the questions come up in the chat, I just want to address it. If you already have districts, the Federal Voting Rights Act applies regardless across the board. This always applies to you. There's a different state Voting Rights Act that only applies to jurisdictions that are at large, that don't already have districts or that aren't drawing districts. So this thing, the thing up on my screen right now, applies everywhere across the country, in every city, in every state. And if you meet these criteria, if there are sizable, relatively concentrated minority communities with different preferences, you face discrimination, chances are good you've got an obligation under federal law to design those districts to give minorities an equitable opportunity to elect candidates. The third thing to keep in mind, oh, sorry, this is just a way of reminding you in a slide exactly what I just said. The California version of this, the state version, applies to jurisdictions with at-large elections. And so if you've got districts or are getting districts, the state version might not apply to you. The third thing to keep in mind is when you're drawing districts that include race or ethnicity, consider other factors at the same time. There are rules that say it's fine to consider race, but race can only predominate if there's a really good reason for it. You all do this every time you drive. It's really important to obey the speed limit, but you're not focused like a laser on the speed limit. You're not staring through your steering wheel at the speed limit. If you do, you're going to crash. Instead, you're looking at the speed limit, but you're also looking at the weather, the traffic, the route. You're looking at the radio and the lights and your passengers and the people in the back seat, and you're checking in from time to time on the speed limit. That's what you want to do with respect to race and ethnicity. It's fine to have a racial component in mind, to check in from time to time on the speed limit, but you also want to make sure that you're considering other factors as well. Aside from equal population, aside from race and ethnicity, there are rules about contiguity. All parts of a district have to be connected to each other. You can't have one piece strung out separate and unconnected from the rest of the district. Water does weird things. So here in Naples and Long Beach, there's a part of the district that's not connected to anything else other than by a bridge or a tunnel or a ferry. That's fine, but make sure that you connect the dots, that you connect these otherwise disconnected places with bridges or tunnels or ferries if you've got a waterway. Another rule that state law now imposes on you is that you should consider and try to minimize the division of neighborhoods. Sometimes, here again, Long Beach, those neighborhoods will be defined more or less by the local jurisdiction. There will be set things that are called the neighborhoods that your city recognizes as established. Other times, neighborhoods are going to be a little more fuzzy. They're not going to be defined by city council. They're not going to be defined by a charter. There may be neighborhoods established by realty groups. There may be neighborhoods that people feel are their own neighborhoods, and you're going to have to figure out how you want to account for what you think the neighborhoods are. This is very similar to accounting for communities of interest. Karin talked about this in the earlier presentation. All a community of interest is a population that shares an interest in legislation. So a group of people who may have social or cultural or economic or employment or workplace or housing reasons to have a common interest in stuff. And there's no set way to decide mathematically what a community of interest is or isn't, or at least there are many, many ways to decide. Really, this is a judgment call for you and for the city council members in your jurisdiction who are deciding where the districts are about what the important groups of people are in your community and whether it's possible, if they live in concentrated areas, to keep them together when you're drawing district lines. Neighborhoods and communities of interest work together. Sometimes they're fairly defined and sometimes they're not. Last set of rules around compactness. you may hear about this, and I want to spend just another minute. I know I'm reaching the end of my time. I want to spend just another minute on compactness rules, in part because you may hear about them in a way that doesn't reflect California law. So some people think about compactness in terms of abstract shapes, whether a district is stringy or round or square or geometrically regular. But that doesn't fit California law. Redistricting software may think about compactness in terms of geometric formulas. There are 100 different ways to calculate whether a district is compact, and you'll see some of these in redistricting software. But that doesn't fit California law. Instead, California law requires that you not bypass nearby population for farther population. This is lower down on the priority list. So if you have to bypass nearer population for farther population for reasons of the Voting Rights Act, for example, that's fine. Or in order to keep communities together, that's fine. But if you've already taken care of communities that need a district under the Voting Rights Act, if you've already taken care of neighborhoods or communities of interest that should be kept together, and you're looking for other criteria to apply, California says, don't bypass the closer population in order to get the population further down the road. Here's an example. This district would bypass those people that are in between one hub of population and another. And so under California's definition, even though this district looks kind of regular, even though it's not geometrically nuts, drawing that red district might violate California's standard for what it means to be compact. The last rule, and this is going to be easier for many of you because of California's nonpartisan local elections, don't draw districts for the purpose of favoring or discriminating against a political party. That's something that California asks across the board. That also means that if there are nonpartisan elections, formally nonpartisan elections, but your candidates happen to be endorsed by members of various political parties, don't set out to draw districts in order to favor some or disfavor others. That's against the law as well. That's my wrap up of all that you might need or want to know in 15 minutes, or 16 or 17. I got a little permission from some of the moderators. There's more information on all of these things as they apply nationally, but also in California on a website I've got called All About Redistricting. You should be able to find it. I'm happy to hang out and answer questions in the chat or otherwise. But with that, I'll turn you over to Angelo, who talk about how this actually works in practice rather than just in theory.
Thank you, Justin. Excellent presentation, very meaningful. Appreciate all the detail as well. On that note, Angelo, take it away.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Should the screen is shared here? Okay. Okay. Are we okay here with screen sharing? Okay, good. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Justin, for that presentation. Obviously, trying to get all these criteria and discussions of criteria within 10 or 15 minutes is only very difficult. And as Justin mentioned, I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney for this particular set of discussions. So I just want to cover a few things that are related to both the criteria that you'll be working with, as well as a little bit of a reflection on some of the experiences I had as a commissioner for the State Redistricting Commission, and the fact that they can actually be an excellent resource for you as you're doing your local redistricting work. So, okay. So very quickly, just in terms of what I'm going to cover a little bit about the process. You spend most of the morning actually talking about the various timelines, but I want to focus on how the process is integrated with getting information and using that information to apply the criteria and ultimately draw the drafts and the final maps. I want to spend a little more time on the federal VRA and then communities of interest as particular criteria. And then I'll spend just a few moments talking about some considerations related to commissions for those of you who are working with commissions, or as Jonathan mentioned, if you're considering commissions, you have to get that started right away because of the timelines that are involved. Okay. So again, as other speakers have mentioned, the the new criteria under the Fair Maps Act parallels what we see at the state level in terms of redistricting, and there are particularly important timelines and baseline requirements that are there. You can of course exceed these if you want to have more than one set of drafts, if you want to have more hearings. The point of trying to have all of this input is to make sure that you are well informed as line drawers or your designated line drawers, and that you're able to get public input, and that you're able to work with that input to revise, to fix, to update some of the work you've done through the process. Karin has mentioned the various elements of what can be involved in drawing on consultants and other people of expertise. This is a tricky question for all of you because you're dealing with limited resources. Your budgets are tight. I would certainly recommend that you developed, if not the in-house capacity, but certainly to look at having a line drawing consultant who specializes in redistricting. There are, as was mentioned before, various software tools that can be applied that are publicly available, very low cost or no cost. Legal counsel, most of you, I think, are probably going to be working with your city attorneys or county counsel in terms of working here. Obviously, your consultants may or may not have attorneys or assisting them. If you have the budget, you might consider bringing in separate legal counsel. That's again a resource question for you. And then in looking specifically at Federal Voting Rights Act compliance and looking at what's called racially polarized voting, Justin covered that in terms of looking at different preferences that exist in the historical voting records of different racial and ethnic groups within your jurisdiction. You have to think about, well, how should we try to budget this? Should we look at just our legal counsel? Certainly consultants who specialize in redistricting will have a lot of experience with this, but do we want to actually go a little bit further and maybe hire an additional consultant or someone to do some polarized voting? That's obviously an important resource decision for you, but if you have the budget to do it, I'd certainly recommend it just to play it safe. So one thing to stress again in terms of the criteria is that they are ranked. It's not absolutely explicit in the law, but I think it's fairly clear that the federal criteria apply to everybody, including those of you who are in charter cities, but that the federal criteria, the constitutional requirements of equal population, as well as the federal VRA will apply and should outrank the state criteria. It doesn't explicitly say that in the Fair Maps Act, the way it does in the state law applying to the state redistricting, but I would assert that federal law will outrank the state level criteria. And then the criteria themselves under state, which Justin highlighted, are also ranked. And that ranking is important because it helps you make decisions in terms of when you have conflicting testimony, when you have conflicting input saying, well, why are you dividing my community of interest? Why are you dividing my neighborhood? Well, we're looking at creating a voting rights applicable district here because we need to protect the minority group. So those are designed to actually help you as line drawers and also to help the public understand what the priorities are. As was mentioned before, neighborhoods and communities of interest are the sort of the core of what you'll receive as public input. They're sort of the drivers of the redistricting in terms of what the public will offer you. In essence, they are the building blocks for drawing larger districts and putting the whole set of maps together. So those are critical elements in terms of how you consider input and what you should be prioritizing as information that you're going to be getting. Couple points just in terms of criteria. Make it clear to the public that these are the criteria that you're applying and that they are ranked in a certain way. There is a natural tendency both among members of the general public as well as people who are drawing lines to sort of look at other ways or other saliency among the different criteria. So for example, there's a tendency to say, well, we've got all this public input that's coming from all these folks who are testifying and sending us maps. We really should prioritize communities of interest. Now that's important, but again, communities of interest ranks below contiguity, it ranks below the federal requirements. So you have to remember that those higher ranking criteria are more important than the lower ones. There is a natural tendency, and this is something I had to deal with, everybody on the commission, and I think the public generally deals with, is that you tend to want to have nice looking maps, aesthetically pleasing maps that don't have strange borders, that look like nice, clean geometric forms. That's a natural tendency. Compactness is the last criterion in terms of the ranking. So you have to remember that even though it's nice to have a pretty picture, there are important criteria that have ranked just having what appear to be nice looking districts. Okay. Justin gave you a very abbreviated analysis of the federal VRA. A number of you have just gone to district because you were sued under the California VRA. Regardless of whether you were sued or not, the federal VRA applies to you. It is different from other kinds of civil rights laws in terms of what you're doing for redistricting, because you are working with, in essence, a litigation framework. And the question fundamentally becomes, well, what is the risk of our being sued if we draw the wrong kinds of districts, right? So that's a different kind of analysis in terms of whether you were going to be regulated by a federal agency or a state agency telling you, well, this is how you should draw the districts. You might recall, or some of you might have been covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in the last redistricting cycle. Section 5 is no longer applicable, at least as of this date. One thing you should be aware of is that there is likely to be legislation moving fairly quickly in the Congress to try to restore Section 5. It's not entirely clear whether that legislation, even if passed this year, will apply to you because of the timing of redistricting, but it's something to certainly keep on your radar screen. So as you're doing an analysis of how you're going to be drawing districts, it's a combination of things. You want to look at, were we covered by Section 5 previously, the 4 counties that were covered before in the last cycle, you know who you are because of requirements to deal with what's called pre-clearance. If you were sued, or if you just settled a lawsuit, or you preemptively went to districts in terms of California Voting Rights Act litigation, how does that affect your analysis? Did you already draw districts that were designed to provide opportunities to minorities? Did you already undergo a racially polarized voting analysis? All of those factors, I think, are important in terms of how you look at the current redistricting cycle. Again, the basic approach here is to look at districts that can protect minority groups who tend to vote together. There may be, block voting against minority candidates or they'll run counter to minority preferences. The typical Voting Rights Act compliant district is one that's called a majority minority district. There's a lot of nuance in terms of how you look at the populations, the percentages there, but certainly your consultant, if you bring them on, will have a detailed knowledge of how all that works. For those of you who are dealing with, already have some majority minority districts, you have to be very attentive to new census numbers. You don't want to sort of draw the same lines over again because there may be significant population growth within some of your districts, and you might risk packing too many minority voters into one or more districts. So that's something to pay attention to as you're going through a demographic analysis. Some of you may be dealing with population growth with combined populations. This is a question you might want to consider, whether there are multiple minority populations that need to be sort of put into a single district for purposes of the Voting Rights Act. There's a lot of nuance when you look at this. I'd certainly suggest you can work with your consultant, work with your counsel in terms of looking at that possibility. In terms of demographic data, take advantage of what the state commission is working on. They're doing a lot of demographic analysis in the next couple months. A lot of that will apply to everybody in the state in terms of some of the new census numbers, some of the analyses of what's called the American Community Survey, and some of that data that is applicable to the VRA in terms of compliance. So take a look at that, look at higher level government. And if you're a city, you might have some county resources that are available to you as well. Finally, and again, this is a question of how you want to devote your resources. I would recommend, if you can budget it, to try to get some racially polarized voting analysis done if you haven't had to already do that, either through litigation or through past work in terms of drawing districts. Can you get away with drawing a compliant district without having done this analysis? Sure. And again, this is a question of whether you want to take a risk of being sued in the future. Don't assume that there's polarized voting, and don't assume that there isn't polarized voting. But it's something to certainly weigh, and again, examine your own histories in terms of how the jurisdiction has actually dealt with this kind of issue. Okay. Communities of interest, I've already seen some questions in the chat room. Again, it's a very open-ended sort of definition, looking at common social and economic interests. There are some prohibited considerations in communities of interest, but typically one can think of various types of communities: racial and ethnic populations, populations with comparable income levels, similar living standards. If you're a larger jurisdiction, you might have a difference between urban and suburban areas within your jurisdiction, urban, rural. There may be particular business districts, industrial, agricultural. All of those are potential communities of interest. And I suggest that you take a look at some of the demographics of your own jurisdiction, and be open to commentary from the public as well. Okay, just a couple points on how racial communities of interest may intersect with the federal VRA. Often you have smaller populations that might not form the majority of a population within a district. So that might be asserted as a community of interest that needs to be kept intact. There might be less evidence of polarized voting within your jurisdiction or within particular areas of your city or county. So maybe the VRA isn't going to be applicable, but we can still look at maintaining a racial community of interest. And then there are certain ethnic populations which aren't necessarily covered specifically by the federal VRA. And they're often, let's say, a lot of European or Middle Eastern ethnic populations have significant concentrations within your cities. Examples include Armenian population in Glendale, Afghani populations in Fremont. Those might be ones that you hear about and want to maintain within particular districts. Okay. A point that Justin made, you have to look at race in tandem with other factors. If you look solely at racial demographics and don't look at anything else, you could get in trouble. Not necessarily under the Voting Rights Act, but under the federal constitution, which sort of imposes some serious limits on looking just at race and looking at it as just the predominant factor in drawing lines. And one thing again to remember, and this is why ranking is important, there may be potential conflicts between VRA districts and particular communities of interest within the jurisdiction. You have to be able to say, well, we need to draw this set of districts here or these particular lines because the VRA really compels us to do so. We have to maintain this population, even though we might have to limit or divide some of the communities of interest or neighborhoods. Okay. A couple final points, and this is just sort of some hints for those of you who are dealing with commissions. A lot of the commissioners you're dealing with now are maybe rookies in terms of redistricting. They haven't done redistricting before, but they're very interested in what they're doing. You have to look at the composition of that commission. What are the skills? What expertise do they have? And then trying to round that out with staff for the city or county, as well as consultants and folks that you're going to hire to make sure that you have a good set of skills among the group that you're dealing with. There is an important distinction in terms of how commissions often work, in terms of they're doing a lot more. They tend to do more public input than you might see with either council drawn or legislatively drawn districts. So it's important to try to help them understand that there's a balance and a set of goals that you have to keep your eye on when you're drawing districts, which is to say, we want to do a good amount of education outreach, we want a lot of public input, but ultimately we do have to draw out these lines and making sure that the timelines and the allocation of resources is balanced. There was a tendency, and I think this is something you'll see if you look at our or my commission's past work, as well as the current state commission, is that there's a high emphasis on doing education and outreach and input, but you may not necessarily leave yourself enough time for the line drawing. So it's important to maintain these democratic procedures, but you ultimately you do have to draw the map. So that's an important consideration, and they have to maintain a good balance in terms of doing that. Okay, and I think I'll just leave my slide up there briefly, and then I'll take this for my email, and then I will take that off and you can go to questions. Okay.
Well, thank you, Angelo. Thank you, Justin. Really appreciate your presentations. And on that note, we do have some questions from the audience. And then if anyone else has additional questions, please put that in the chat. And first question will be as follows. It's from Shirley G. She says the following: please cover how to prioritize when communities of interest conflict or overlap along borders and a map. Also, please define social and economic under communities of interest.
Justin, or you want me to?
Yeah, if you guys both want to.
I'll take a stab, but I think Angelo's probably going to say the exact same thing, which is you've got a lot of discretion in figuring out how you're going to determine which communities are really most meaningful in any given area. There's no legal guide or mandate that says the more letters you receive has to be the community of primary importance or anything like that. So it's really, the law leaves you a lot of discretion to determine for yourselves what the most impactful community or the community most in need of preserving in a district might be. And there's similarly no real further guide to what social or economic concerns might be beyond a group that has a common interest in legislation. And that could be a lot of different things. You might have in one part of the city or county, renters or owners. In another part, it might be an industry group. In another part, it might be a certain group of people with a cultural or ethnic affiliation. In another part of the city or county, it might be a group that ranches or that has horses or that has some other agricultural need. And those things don't all have to be perfectly consistent throughout a city. So if you've got an industry that is really important in one area, you don't have to make all of your choices in that regard industries. It's really up to you to decide which community is most in need of a district that reflects their unique needs in any part of your jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I'll agree entirely with that. And one thing to note, even though this is a sort of a technical topic, it is more of an art than a science. And ultimately, there are going to have to be judgments that human beings make, which is to say, well, we have conflicting testimony here, and we have to make a call here and try to decide what kind of how these pieces sort of fit together best. And inevitably, you're going to have some saying, well, I don't really like those lines, and some people say, oh, those lines look great, I love them. And that's just sort of the nature of the process, that if you're being democratic about it, you're going to get folks who may disagree, and somebody has to sort of settle and come up with a final product.
Great, thank you guys so much. One more question came in from Douglas Johnson. He said, did the 2011 Commission ever release its statewide polarized voting analysis? And while 10 years old, it could be a very useful source of historical polarized voting analysis, especially in jurisdictions without the funds for their own polarized voting analysis, or where the jurisdiction is too small to get reliable analysis within just the jurisdiction itself.
Yeah, the quick answer is no, it didn't. And since I'm not a current commissioner, I don't have any power or influence over the current commission to release that data. Even though the commission's work was done, basically almost 10 years ago, I think for litigation purposes, the way it was set up, the VRA Council decided to keep it safe and treat it as basically privileged information. I don't think that the current commission is going to release that data until the new analyses are done. I think that's, but I can't speak for them. That's sort of where it's at.
Great, thank you. Oh, Justin, go for it.
And I'll add a tiny little bit to what Angelo just said. He mentioned during his presentation that if you have the budget or the resources, that doing this analysis to try and figure out from the data, do minorities in the community have really distinct preferences from other members of the community, that's the sort of gold standard. But it's not, I want to stress, it's not the exclusive way to demonstrate that voting is racially polarized. If you're in a smaller jurisdiction and you really don't have that budget, jurisdictions have in the past defended the maps they've drawn on the basis of really involved testimony from communities about their distinct preferences in the voting process. I will say the one thing you can't do is just rely on stereotype. So make sure you have some backup rather than just, I assume that all people who look like X have different preferences than all people who look like Y. That's not okay. But empirical data comes in a lot of different forms. And if the gold standard is, and if you're a bigger jurisdiction, you might have to pursue a real rigorous quantitative study. in much smaller jurisdictions, it's possible to get your empirical data through other means that don't involve the sort of massive database of election returns and crunching those election returns.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Angelo. So, sincerely appreciate all of the feedback and insight you provided. It was very useful and helpful for everyone. So thank you once again for all of that. And with that being said, we're going to transition out of this segment into our nuts and bolts of implementation. On that note, I want to transfer it over to Kiyana Asemanfar from Common Cause, and she'll take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Zach, for leading today's program. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today. I'm really delighted to see over 260 people who have joined us live for today's session. Just want to flag that this meeting is being recorded. We do plan to post the recording on our website along with all of the speakers' presentations, as well as supplemental documents that Common Cause and our partners created. So we will follow up next week with those materials. And further, I see great representation from across the state. If you have colleagues from your city or county or commission who weren't able to join, we will also be following up to share all the materials, and feel free to share it with them as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for this panel. First is Zach Beck, who has been today's MC. Zach is the city clerk for the city of Escondido and has served in leadership positions in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors as a government official, small business operator, and nonprofit director. He previously served as the city clerk of Oceanside and implemented the city's transition to district elections in 2018. And right now he is working on facilitating the work of the Escondido Independent Redistricting Commission. We are also joined by Jackie Guzman, Deputy City Manager for the city of Sunnyvale. Jackie oversees communications, manages citywide initiatives, and serves as the city's diversity and inclusion liaison. She has over 10 years of experience in local government, holding a range of roles, including human resources manager and budget analyst. So thank you to both of you for joining us today. I thought I would start out by asking you, Jackie, you led the districting process in Sunnyvale, and there was really robust community participation in that process. I was curious, what methods did you use to engage the public, and what was the public's value add in that process?
Thank you for the question. So I will share that our process is really extensive because we were moving into district-based elections, and we needed to get input not just on drawing the maps, but what our districts should look like, number of districts, how to elect our mayor. And so we really did need our community to tell us what their preferences were throughout that process. So we did a lot of different things. I think the first thing that we did is we need to find out who do we need to talk to. And so we went through an extensive community mapping process, not in mapping geography, but in mapping who are our nonprofits, our social service groups, our parent groups, our churches. Who are all of the people that are connected to community and that can help us reach out to various members of our community? And we are particularly interested in reaching folks that generally don't come to City Hall to our 5-hour-long council meetings. We wanted to find out, where are those folks going and how can we reach them where they are at? And that was really our approach. So we had, of course, our traditional community meetings where we invited people to our community center or our city hall for a community meeting, but we did a lot of going to where people are at. And so we built relationships with different organizations and actually piggybacked a lot on their existing meetings just to go and do short presentations around what is this process? What is moving to district-based elections? How do people get involved? And so we did a lot of that. And then the picture that you're showing here is we did a lot of what we call pop-up events. And so this was, again, going to where people were at. There's a picture of me about 8 months pregnant talking to a community member outside of a church. And so we did connect with our churches, and some of them allowed us to table outside and talk to parishioners as they were coming out of mass, which was really a great way to engage people on an important issue. But we also did pop-ups at our farmers market, we have a big state of the city that's sort of like a festival. And so we went to our state of the city, we went to different cultural events because we wanted to reach different ethnic groups and make sure we touched on everyone. And the other thing that I would say that we did is we wanted to capture who we were talking to. And so we had a short one-page demographic survey that allowed us to understand who we were reaching. And so we could go back and look at that data and say, okay, have we reached enough of the Latino population? Have we reached enough of the South Asian population? And so, or even a geographic area of the city, have we reached North Sunnyvale, or have we reached Central Sunnyvale? And so we were really able to use that data to make sure that all the feedback we were getting was representative of everyone in the city.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, I'm hearing two major lessons there. One is going where people already are, and two is kind of continually assessing, which communities you're reaching and what the gaps might be over the course of the redistricting period so that you can correct and make sure that you're reaching everyone during that process. I guess to the first point, how are you thinking about community outreach now in the age of COVID? How are you thinking about adjusting that strategy?
Yeah, it's definitely much more difficult. I think right now I have been reaching out to different groups and people are still meeting virtually. And so I am still planning on tapping in, and actually already have gone particularly to parent groups and started talking to them about the city moving into this redistricting process. We may or may not have a commission. We're sort of in the middle of that discussion with our council right now. But if we do form a redistricting commission, then I want to already have those connections with those groups, because I'm going to be going to them to encourage people to apply for the redistricting commission. And so I'm already starting to do some outreach and starting to ask, hey, can I be invited to your meeting in a month so I can do, a 5 or 10 minute blurb about what the city is doing. So people are still meeting virtually. And so you have to tap into those virtual meetings. I also think that we've really stepped up our game with social media and with our virtual meetings and trying to make them more, figure out how to make them interactive so that people do come. In some ways, COVID has taught us that people are willing to come to virtual meetings, and we've seen more attendance at our council meetings now that they're virtual than in person. So it's not necessarily a bad situation. I'm thinking that, by the fall, we may be able to have in-person meetings, but even when we can do that, I still want to have that virtual and that in-person mix, because I think it's going to be more effective.
Great. Definitely think that a hybrid version of outreach could be good. Also great to hear that you're thinking about a commission in Sunnyvale. And to that point, Zach has experience districting without a commission and is currently managing Escondido's independent redistricting commission. So I wanted to ask him, what the difference is with approaching the redistricting process with and without a commission, and what he would advise both types of jurisdictions.
Well, thanks, Kiyana. I appreciate the question. And yeah, it's been very interesting going through both processes. Back in 2017, Oceanside, California was part of the slew of cities that got hit by a lawsuit to switch from at-large elections to district elections. So we began that transitional process in a very tight time frame. So fortunately, we were able to contract with a demographer, worked with Karin MacDonald at that time to be able to facilitate the process. But one of the things I learned throughout that was we just went, we were pretty aggressive in our public outreach and engaging the public and having meetings throughout the community, basically facilitating a similar process as to what we saw transpire with the most recent assembly bill that got passed with Bonta, who brought that forward, where we have to have a certain number of meetings. The one downside of not having a commission was there was a little less structure in the formality of actually facilitating the meeting. I actually ended up becoming the person who had to sort of facilitate the dialogue with the public, and that just was fine thing to do. It ultimately ended up working out, but I believe that the formal structure of a commission provides a little bit of an easier interface with the community in order to make sure that everyone's being heard properly. As a matter of fact, I have all of the recordings of the different public hearings we held during the time in Oceanside. I'll put a link in the description to that page, which shows kind of how that process unfolded. And you can kind of see the distinction between something like that in comparison to what we're doing right now in Escondido, which is a formal redistricting commission where we had a very robust recruitment process. We're able to get a diverse set of candidates to come and apply and to be actually appointed to serve as commissioners. We actually had an independent selection committee of retired judges who actually made the selection. So the council wasn't involved in any way, shape, or form of being able to influence that in any way. So I've really enjoyed so far the structure of the redistricting commission. Right now we have our regular meetings. We're going through a formal process, setting a budget, doing all of that. And obviously this go around for most cities, because we have more time to implement the districts as opposed to a lot of the cities who were hit with that lawsuit a couple of years ago. You have more time to prepare this, but I would say if you are considering a redistricting commission, now's the time to really get that going, because you will want to do a very robust recruitment to be able to get people on board. Just like Jackie was saying, if reaching out to those certain individuals, making sure you have a very independent group who's able to serve in that capacity. So I think there's benefits to both. It really is just contingent upon size of your city, the level of public engagement you currently have, and hopefully being able to get enough people to apply for the redistricting commission together, because that can also be sometimes a challenge, as you know, with trying to get people to serve on various boards and commissions. So that's another factor you'd want to take into consideration. But I would say, have preferred the experience so far going with a formal redistricting process.
Great, thank you. And for those who are thinking about commissions, I encourage you to visit localredistricting.org. There's some great resources there that can kind of walk you through the various options for establishing a commission. And I think Jackie's approach of kind of laying the groundwork for outreach for the commission is great. And I think that's great, regardless of whether or not you're going to go with a commission, to start early and kind of build a runway for your redistricting process. So I'll ask both of you, looking back on the districting process, what worked best that you're bringing with you into this new cycle, and what would you do differently? What would you might leave behind in the last cycle? Jackie, would you like to go?
Sure. Well, we had a ton of lessons. I mean, you tried so many different things. We had, I would say, in addition to a robust engagement process, we had a robust budget to go along with that. And we are in different times. I think all of us are feeling the economic effects of COVID. And so at least in my community, we have less resources. And so we're going to have to be much more scrappy in our approach. And so in doing that, am really thinking about the most effective things that we did, and then how best to use our consulting funding. Obviously, we need a demographer no matter what, but we had an outreach consultant that really helped out with a lot of the facilitation at all of our meetings. We had, we didn't have a commission, but we had an advisory, citizens advisory committee that helped advise on outreach efforts. And so that was helpful because they became sort of our ambassadors to connect with other community members or groups that we were having difficulty with. And so I do hope that if we do move into having a redistricting commission, that our commissioners still take on that role of being ambassadors, because that was really helpful. I also, you know, in looking at all of the pop-ups and the different groups that I went to, some were more successful than others, and you'll just have to try it and figure out which ones were most successful. And so obviously we now are focusing on those groups that we had the most fruitful outcomes and engagement with. And so I'm gonna be focused on that. We also tried a couple of different survey tools. The one that we found worked best was Open City Hall. And it's not because of specifically because of that platform, but because we had already used that in the past. And so there were already, I think we had already 600 subscribers to that survey tool, and many community members were already comfortable with that. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Go with the things that already work in your other outreach efforts. And so we're gonna continue to use that tool. We're gonna continue to do pop-ups because they were really successful. In terms of things that didn't work, I'm not so sure. I think that we had a pretty successful process, and we're just honing it.
Great. Yeah, excellent, Jackie. And I will echo a lot of the points that she made. I think we're fantastic as it relates to just the importance of transitioning over to this next stage of going through the redistricting process, making sure that you're doing everything you can to engage the public. But one of the key points that she touched on, which I think is important and something that I think is necessary for all of us to really consider, is our budget going into this. And obviously COVID has impacted all the municipal budgets throughout the state and throughout the country. So factoring that in right now is going to be essential. Obviously with the demographer, that's going to be an important element to make sure that everything is done properly. If you're going to consider going to council for a budget, I would probably be more on the side of erring to try and get as much of the budget initially as possible, as opposed to having to go back to the well multiple times over the course of the next fiscal year to try and request budget adjustments or anything like that. For context, in Escondido, we had our Redistricting Commission already established, and we went forward and actually just got in a budget approved last night by the council for $200,000 to get through this. So, every community is going to have a different approach, but our commission decided to request a higher amount initially, so we're not having to go back 2 or 3 months down the road and ask for additional resources. So that's just something to consider from a strategic point. Think about how your city manager is going to view this. Think about how your council is going to view this. This is something that legally we have to do. So you do have a little bit of leverage in that sense when you're coming before your council for allocating resources. So try and utilize that to your advantage, because you want to make sure the reason you're getting this funding is to reach out to the public to provide the most transparent process possible. So these are taxpayer dollars spent very wisely, in my opinion. So I think just trying to get as many resources as possible for this is important to do, even in the context that we're facing right now with COVID.
Yeah, actually, I want to add one more thing. So one thing that made our community, I think, really happy with the process is that it was really a community-driven map-making process. We provided tools, Maptitude specifically, in addition to Excel and paper tools, for members of our community to be able to draw maps themselves, and we allowed them to submit partial maps or full maps. And we had several technical assistance training so that people could play with the maps. If they were having trouble, they could work with our demographers to work out any kinks and then make sure that the maps were viable maps. And so we had 26 submissions of maps, which I think is pretty good because maps are pretty technical. And then our demographer developed 3 maps, and 19 of the community maps were full maps. And our council ended up, with community input narrowing, but they didn't, even in the first cut, they did not choose the demographer maps. They chose the community's maps. And then we allowed the same community members to refine their maps with community input and council input. And so they had at least 2 chances to revise their maps based on the feedback that they received. And at the end of the day, we chose a community map that was developed by a very diverse group of community members. And so everybody was happy with that outcome. And so I'd encourage you, empower your community to draw the maps and advocate for their maps. And if it can be a map that's developed by community members, it's going to be much more well received than if it's something developed by council or even a commission, frankly.
Completely concur with that. And one last thing I was thinking of, and just as you're going through this process, we've talked a lot about the importance of public engagement, hosting a robust process. You also might want to be sensitive to the fact of what your current level of public engagement is from your city council. For instance, if your current council meetings are being held via Zoom and they aren't getting that much public engagement, but your redistricting commission is maybe more so doing even a better job than that, you want to factor that in as well. Just more advice bias in anything. You want to be doing everything you can possible to increase the overall engagement, but you also want to make sure that you're not getting out ahead of your skis. So that way your city council, your city manager, anything doesn't get upset with that. So I know it's a strange thing, but I just want to mention that because that was a pointed topic that we had as we're thinking through planning this training today, that we've already seen some cities encountering that issue already. So just something to factor in. Just want to throw that out there.
Thanks so much to the both of you. A lot of helpful tips and various factors I know that folks in cities and counties have that you all did in the last cycle, and the various things to be aware of this cycle. I think there are a lot of great points that were made. I just wanted to touch on some of them. Jackie, I know you talked about working with the outreach consultant, potentially engaging a commission or even a committee to focus on that. I would encourage folks, even in the absence of any of those sort of infrastructure, just the importance of reaching out to community groups and engaging them early on in the process. You could even invite a community group to present to your council or commission or redistricting body about the best ways to engage the communities in that jurisdiction. So inviting them in early, I think, is really, really important. And I know budgets are obviously top of mind for everyone right now. So the point about building on an existing infrastructure, I think not only helps to kind of make that outreach strategy more effective, but also is more efficient when it comes to budget. And lastly, to that point, I would really encourage cities and counties to coordinate and maybe even share resources when it comes to community outreach. Not only are you being more efficient with your budget, but I think from a community perspective, it's really helpful to hear about both the city and county redistricting process that's going on and having that outreach be kind of streamlined and all that information be consolidated. So with that, I think we will move and close this panel. Thank you so much to Zach and Jackie for sharing your insights and perspectives. Thank you. With that, I will hand it to Kathy, who's going to share some final reminders and help close us out.
Yes, I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Okay, great. Just double checking. So I know a lot of folks have been excitedly sharing information on the chats and have certainly asked a couple of times, are we going to be recording this, and how do we get a copy of this, and how do I let my friends and colleagues also know about this training? The good news is that we are recording today's sessions. We have delved into a broad overview of local redistricting, and there are many, many resources out there. We will be collecting them all in one spot, and we'll be emailing you after this session with not only the recording, but also the PowerPoints and some additional handouts. It'll all be in one spot. So if you all will just give us a minute, we'll pull it all together and expect a follow-up since you've registered in this conference today. And please do, as we've been sharing people's emails, consider us all to be resources. I know many of the presenters here are very, very willing to rinse and repeat for your particular jurisdiction, whether that's a county or a city, and to serve as resources. So we will have both sort of the online resources that you can kind of hand out and share, but also human resources. So I would just want to thank every one of you for joining us today. You are inspiring us. You're letting us know that the process of redistricting is one that you are ready to tackle and make as open and inclusive and transparent as possible. We thank you for that. And with that, I turn it back to Zach Beck.
All right. Hey, well, thank you, Kathy, for everything. And as a reminder, you're going to get a email here shortly with all the information that was covered today in our session. Just a really quick shout out to all of the speakers for the great content, and a special shout out to Common Cause for all of the great work they did. This was months worth of planning and effort went into this, specifically Kiyana and Alton and Kathy and Lori and Karin and everyone who's been involved with this. I just want to say thank you to them, and thank you to you for attending and being a part of this. I wish you the best of success as you move forward into the redistricting process for your municipality or your district. And hopefully we can do everything we can throughout the state of California to lead the way for the country as it relates to public engagement and doing a great job of representing our constituents the best way possible to make sure our redistricting process is efficient and we get a great representation in our leadership and elected offices throughout the state.